Tonight, let us travel together to the edge of the desert, to a place where the sand meets the sky and the stone meets the stars, and where something stands that has been standing longer than almost anything else on Earth. There is nothing here you need to carry with you, no worry that cannot wait until morning. You can simply let the words wash over you, the way the desert wind moves over warm stone, and let yourself drift down gently towards sleep. This is the story of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Picture, if you will, the western bank of the Nile River in the land of Egypt, in a time before nearly all of recorded history as we know it. The river here is broad and slow, and the color of dark copper in the late afternoon. On one side of it, the green delta stretches north toward the sea, thick with papyrus and the sound of birds. And on the other side, the desert begins almost immediately, golden and vast and utterly still. It is here, on the edge of that desert, on a wide and level plateau of pale limestone, that human hands did something that has never quite been equaled. They raised a mountain, they shaped it precisely, and they left it for the rest of time. Let us begin at the beginning. Pyramid was built for a king. His name in the ancient Egyptian language was Khufu. The Greeks who came later called him Cheops, and that name too has followed him down through history. He ruled Egypt in the period we call the Fourth Dynasty, which means he was a king of the Old Kingdom, a time when Egypt was young and confident in organizing itself into something tremendous. The age of Khufu was roughly 4,500 years ago. Sit with that for a moment, 4,500 years. The Roman Empire, which feels so old to us, lay more than 2,000 years in the future. The armies of Alexander the Great had not yet marched. Even the Great Trojan War, which the Greeks told as ancient legend, was still 1,000 years ahead. When Khufu's pyramid was new, almost nothing we think of as ancient had yet happened. And yet there it stood. Khufu himself is a figure who lives at the edge of what we can know. We have a single small ivory statue of him, barely 4 centimeters tall, and it is the only confirmed portrait of a man who built one of the largest structures in the history of the world. We know he was the son of the pharaoh Sneferu, a great builder in his own right, and that he ruled for perhaps 2 decades, perhaps longer. The records are not always complete. But what his people built for him tells us something enormous about his power and about the civilization that served him. Now let us set the scene, because you deserve to feel it before you sleep. Imagine standing on the Giza Plateau at dawn. The air is dry and faintly cool, carrying the smell of dust and limestone, and very distantly the green breath of the river. The sky in the east is beginning to pale, a band of rose and gold appearing above the horizon, and the stars overhead are still bright in the blue-black of the western sky. And rising before you, so tall that your eye has to climb it, is the pyramid. Even stripped of its original casing, even worn at the edges by 4,500 years of wind and time, it is enormous beyond what the mind expects. It rises in great stepped tiers, one layer of stone upon another, diminishing as it goes, until the summit catches the first pink light of morning. At the height it once stood, before the very tip was worn away and the centuries slowly reduced it, it measured about 146 meters from base to apex. That is nearly 500 feet. For more than 3,500 years, it was the tallest thing that human hands had ever built on the surface of the earth. Nothing surpassed it until the cathedral spires of medieval Europe finally reached higher, and even then only just. Stand before it and you understand in your body and not just your mind what that means. The base of the pyramid covers an area so vast that several large city blocks could be laid within its footprint, and it is not roughly square, it is almost perfectly square. The 4 sides are oriented to the 4 cardinal directions, north and south and east and west, with an accuracy so extraordinary that modern instruments can barely improve upon it. The Egyptians aligned their pyramid to the stars, and they did so with such precision that it still astonishes the people who study it. Within this monument sit roughly 2 million blocks of stone. 2 million, most of them weigh between 2 and 3 tons each, though some of the heaviest, deep in the interior, weigh many times that. They were quarried mostly from the limestone of the plateau itself, right there underfoot and from quarries a short distance away. The granite that lines the innermost chambers came from much further south, from a place called Aswan, 350 miles upstream along the Nile. The Egyptians floated those massive stones down the river on wooden barges when the annual flood raised the waters high enough to carry them close to the building site. Then they were unloaded and dragged on sledges across the ground. workers pouring water ahead of the runners to reduce the friction, so the great stones could slide more easily across the earth. We do not know with perfect certainty how the blocks were lifted into place. The question has fascinated people for centuries. The most widely accepted answer involves ramps, long inclined paths of packed rubble and mud brick that grew with the pyramid as it rose, allowing the sledges carrying the stones to be hauled upward by teams of workers. Whether the ramps wrapped around the outside of the structure, or ran straight up one face, or used some combination of approaches, is something scholars still discuss with interest and care. What is clear is that the organizing intelligence behind the project was formidable. Overseers tracked deliveries and rations in progress. Scribes recorded everything. Teams were given their assignments and their targets, and they met them day after day, year after year, block by block. Copper tools for cutting and shaping the stone, wooden sledges for moving it, and human muscle in vast organized quantities. These are what built the pyramid. No mystery is needed. Only ingenuity, organization, and an extraordinary sustained effort of will. And it was done in approximately 20 years. Now let us speak of the people who did it. For a long time, the popular imagination pictured armies of enslaved workers driven by cruelty and fear, dragging stones under the desert sun. This image is wrong. The archaeology of recent decades has made clear that the pyramid was built not by enslaved people, but by a skilled and organized workforce of paid Egyptian laborers. We know this because we found their village. Excavations near the pyramid uncovered the remains of a workers' settlement, a real town with bakeries and breweries, and a medical facility and sleeping quarters and cemeteries. The tombs there were modest, as the tombs of ordinary people are modest, but they were carefully made, and the people buried in them were given the small dignities that marked them as members of Egyptian society. The bones they left behind show the marks of hard labor, the kind of injuries and healed fractures that heavy physical work produces, but they also show evidence of medical care. These were people whose employers set broken bones and treated wounds. And they ate well. The records, written on scraps of papyrus and on the walls of the settlement, speak of rations issued to the workers. Bread and beer were the staples of the Egyptian diet, and the workers received both. They received fish from the river, and onions and grain. They received beef, which was not a food of the very poor. They worked in rotating gangs with names that translate roughly as the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkora, and they left behind the small marks of their presence, tool marks in stone, and graffiti on hidden walls and places where the outer casing would later cover their signatures. These were proud craftsmen. They knew what they were building. The pyramid was meant to carry their king into eternity, and the act of building it was itself a sacred and meaningful task, participation in the great project of the cosmos as the Egyptians understood it. Let us go inside. The entrance to the pyramid is set into the north face, some distance above the ground. In ancient times, it was concealed beneath smooth white casing stones, invisible to those who did not know where to look. You pass through the outer stone and enter a descending passage, narrow and low, cut at a steep angle down into the bedrock beneath the pyramid itself. The walls are of pale gray limestone, fitted with a tightness that leaves almost no gap between them. The air is still and dry and cool, the way old stone is always cool, and there is a particular smell to it, mineral and ancient, like the smell of a place that has been closed for a very long time. The descending passage leads to an unfinished chamber deep in the bedrock below, a room that was perhaps planned and then set aside as the design evolved. From partway down the descending passage, another corridor climbs back upward at an angle. This ascending passage rises steeply through the core of the pyramid, and it leads to one of the most beautiful spaces in the ancient world. The Grand Gallery. This is a rising corridor nearly 9 meters tall, cut in a technique called corbelling, where each successive layer of stone overhangs the one below it, the walls leaning slightly inward as they climb until they nearly meet at the top, creating a long vaulted space that feels almost like a cathedral nave. The walls are of polished limestone, and the whole thing ascends at a steep angle for almost 47 meters of length. Walking up it, even now, one feels a solemnity, a sense of approach, as though the building itself is preparing you for something. At the top of the Grand Gallery lies the King's Chamber. This is a room of red granite, the hard stone from Aswan, cut and fitted with extraordinary precision. The room is rectangular, and the ceiling is flat rather than vaulted, constructed of 9 enormous granite beams laid side by side. Above these beams, and invisible from within the chamber, are 5 more layers of stone separated by small empty spaces, what engineers call relieving chambers, designed to distribute the colossal weight of the pyramid above and prevent the ceiling from being crushed. These hidden rooms were sealed for 4,000 years before a later explorer discovered them by crawling upward through a narrow gap. In the king's chamber sits a plain rectangular box of dark red granite, lidless and empty. This is the sarcophagus. It is too large to have been brought in through the passages, which means it was placed here as the pyramid was being built, set into the chamber before the stones were laid over it. Whether it ever held the body of Khufu, we cannot say with certainty. By the time explorers reached it, it had long been empty. The pyramid was once dressed in a skin of white limestone. Not the rough gray stone of the interior, but a fine, dense, polished casing stone, brilliant as marble, fitted so precisely that the seams between the blocks were nearly invisible. Imagine the plateau at midday under the Egyptian sun, and the pyramid rising white and blazing, reflecting the light with such intensity that it must have been visible from tremendous distances across the flat desert. The Egyptians called it Khufu's horizon, which is beautiful, because it captures exactly that quality of a thing that seems to belong to the sky rather than the earth. At its very peak sat a capstone called a pyramidion, which was likely gilded or sheathed in gold, so that the very tip of the structure caught the first light of sunrise and the last light of sunset, and glowed like a small bright star against the blue. The casing stones are almost entirely gone now. Over the centuries, especially during the great building booms of medieval Cairo, people quarried them for use in new construction. The white limestone of the pyramid now lines walls and mosques and bridges across the city. What remains is the stepped core, the inner skeleton, rough and honest, which in its own way is also beautiful. Now let us step back further away to see the plateau as a whole. Khufu's pyramid does not stand alone. Beside it, slightly to the southwest, stands a second great pyramid built for his son, the pharaoh Khafre. Khafre's pyramid appears taller because it sits on slightly higher ground, but it is in fact a little smaller. Near its upper section, a small portion of the original white casing stone remains, a pale cap that gives you a glimpse of how the whole plateau must once have looked, gleaming in the sun. Beside Khafre's causeway crouches the great Sphinx, carved from a natural outcrop of limestone, the body of a lion and the face of a king, looking east toward the rising sun. It is enormous, longer than 2 school buses end to end, taller than a 4-story building, and it was carved from the living rock of the plateau itself rather than assembled from separate blocks. The face gazes with an expression that feels, even now, calm and attentive, as though the Sphinx is simply waiting, watching the sun complete another of its endless circuits across the sky. The Sphinx is so old that for much of its history it was buried to the neck in sand, dug out and reburied and dug out again by successive generations of people who came to tend to it. An ancient stela, a carved stone slab standing between its paws, records one such clearing, commissioned by a prince who dreamed the Sphinx spoke to him and asked to be freed from the sand. The dream, the prince's devotion, the old stone recording both. It is a small and touching story in the shadow of something vast. To the southwest of Khafre's pyramid lies a third, somewhat smaller pyramid, built for the pharaoh Menkaure. It is modest compared to the others, but still a massive and dignified structure, and together the 3 pyramids form a grouping that has defined the horizon of this place for 4,500 years. There are also smaller pyramids flanking the main tree, built for the queens and other members of the royal family. And there are mastaba tombs, flat rectangular structures arranged in orderly rows on the plateau like a city of the dead laid out in proper streets, the burial places of the nobles and priests and officials who served the royal family and who wanted to rest forever in the shadow of their king. Stand here in the late afternoon, when the angle of the sun turns everything golden and the shadows grow long, and you're standing in the middle of one of the greatest concentrations of intentional human effort in the history of the world. Every stone placed exactly where it was placed with purpose, every chamber aligned to something larger than itself. The whole plateau a single enormous statement about what a civilization believed was worth doing. What did the Egyptians believe? They believed that the soul of the king did not end with the death of the body. They believed that the pharaoh was a divine figure, a point of connection between the human world and the world of the gods, and that at death he rejoined the divine order and took his place in the sky among the eternal stars. The pyramid was not merely a tomb. It was a stone apparatus built at enormous cost to ensure that the king made his passage correctly. The shape itself was meaningful. The pyramid form may represent the rays of the sun falling to earth, or the primordial mound of creation rising from the waters at the very beginning. Perhaps both. The Egyptians could hold more than one true thing in mind at the same time. The construction of the pyramid was also a statement about the power of the state. To build it required thousands of workers organized over 2 decades, fed and housed and directed by an administrative system of sophisticated efficiency. The pyramid could not exist without a centralized government capable of quarrying and transporting and placing 2 million blocks of stone. And in turn, the act of building it strengthened that government, gave it purpose and identity, drew the whole society into a shared project that made Egypt more coherent and more unified. The pyramid was politics as much as it was piety, and architecture, and engineering, and art. There is something very human about the desire to leave a mark that lasts. We see it in the smallest things, a child writing her name in wet cement, a traveler carving initials into an old tree. And we see it in the largest things imaginable, in a king telling a whole civilization to raise a stone mountain in his name, so that something would remain when everything else had gone. And it worked. Long after the priests who performed the rituals had been forgotten, long after the language in which the prayers were spoken had been lost, long after the very religion that gave the pyramid its meaning had faded from the earth, the pyramid remained. Conquerors came and looked at it, scholars came and measured it, pilgrims came and prayed before it, merchants passed it on their way down the river and looked up, warriors camped at its base. Napoleon stood before it and spoke, so the legend goes, about the 40 centuries that looked down from its heights, and even if those words are partly legend, the feeling behind them is true. For thousands of years, travelers arriving in Egypt could see the pyramids from a great distance, rising above the flat horizon, announcing themselves before anything else was visible. There was no need to ask what they were or who had built them. They answered their own question by their sheer insistence on existing. Everything else had crumbled or burned or been swallowed by the earth. The pyramids stood, older than almost every other human construction on the surface of the planet, still standing, refusing quietly and without apparent effort to end. The ancient Greeks who cataloged the great wonders of their world included the Great Pyramid on their list. And when all the other wonders they named had fallen, some to earthquakes, some to fire, some to simple time, the pyramid alone was still there. It is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it is the only one still standing. That is a sentence worth sitting with quietly for a moment before sleep. The oldest and the only one still there. We understand so much more about the pyramid now than people did even a century ago. We have found the workers' village. We have mapped the internal passages with instruments that can see through stone without disturbing it. We have analyzed the limestone and traced the quarries it came from. We have read the administrative papyri, including the oldest papyri ever found, which happen to record the logistical details of hauling casing stones to the pyramid in the very years of its construction. A foreman named Murer kept a diary, and that diary survived 4,500 years in a sealed cave near the Red Sea. In it he wrote, in his careful hand, about moving stone and receiving rations and the ordinary business of an extraordinary project. His words connect us directly to the building of the pyramid in a way that still feels close to miraculous. And yet there is much we do not know. We do not know exactly what happened to the body of Khufu. We do not know the precise details of how the enormous blocks were raised into place as the structure grew taller. We do not know what the golden capstone looked like when the sun caught it at dawn. We do not know what prayers were spoken in the king's chamber during the rituals of burial. We do not know what Khufu himself thought or felt or hoped for. The little ivory statue does not tell us. The pyramid tells us, but in a language of weight and geometry and silence. There is a quality to ancient Egypt that feels uniquely restful to contemplate. Perhaps it is the scale of the time involved, the way it puts our own lives into a gentle perspective. 4,500 years ago, people rose in the morning and felt the sun on their faces and ate bread and walked to work and worried about things and were glad about things and built something astonishing and then lay down and slept. And the stones they placed are still there, still in place, still holding each other up. The desert shifts around them, and the city of Cairo grows and hums at their feet, and the whole modern world rushes and clamors below. But on the plateau, the pyramids stand in the old silence, in the old light, exactly where they were set. There is a slowness to them that the rest of the world cannot touch. They have outlasted every urgency. There is something very comforting in that kind of permanence. Not everything passes. Some things persist. Some efforts endure far longer than the person who made them could have hoped. Khufu wanted to last forever, which is perhaps the most human wish there is, and in the only way that anything can be said to last forever, he has. And so, as we leave this place tonight, let us hold it kindly in mind. The wide plateau and the pale stone, the cool air of the ascending passage and the long vaulted gallery climbing into the dark, the king's chamber of dark red granite, still and dry and deep in the heart of the structure. The three pyramids on their horizon, the last light of evening turning them amber and rose and the softest shade of gold. The desert spreading away in every direction, quiet and enormous, and above it all the stars beginning to appear, the same stars the builders watched, the same stars they aligned their great work to, burning there in the clear Egyptian dark just as they always have. Let yourself settle now. There is no need to hold any of it too tightly. The pyramid has been standing for 4,500 years, and it will still be there when you wake. The desert is patient, the stone is still. And somewhere on the plateau of Giza, in the long quiet after the last light fades, the ancient shape rises against the stars, and the world is old and at rest, and so gently are you. Let the warmth of the stone carry you. Let the sound of the desert carry you. Let yourself go softly and completely into sleep. Tonight, let us travel together to the edge of the desert, to a plateau high above a wide and ancient river, where the stone itself remembers something older than almost anything else in the human world. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to carry into this hour. You can let your body settle, let your breath slow to something easy and natural, and simply let these words drift over you like warm air moving off the sand at the close of a long golden day. This is the story of the great Sphinx of Giza. Picture, if you will, the western bank of the Nile, in the land the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, named for the dark fertile soil along the river's edge. Beyond that ribbon of green and life, the land rises toward the desert, and the desert is another thing entirely. It is pale and immense and almost perfectly still. The sand holds the heat of the day long into the night, and the silence there is the kind of silence that seems to have weight to it. The silence of great distances, of deep time, of a world that existed long before there were words to describe it. On a low plateau of pale limestone above the floodplain, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom built their tombs. 3 great pyramids stand there, the largest in the world, and beside them, carved from the living rock of the plateau itself, crouches a figure that is both animal and human, both guardian and mystery, both ancient monument and quiet presence that has watched the sun rise over this desert for more than 4,500 years. Let us simply stand before it for a moment and take it in. The Great Sphinx is enormous in a way that words do not easily carry. It stretches 73 meters from the tip of its outstretched paws to the back of its haunches, and it rises to a height of 20 meters at the crown of its head. Try to feel those numbers softly in your mind rather than calculating them. It is long as a city block, tall as a 6-story building, and it is not assembled from blocks brought from distant quarries and stacked with extraordinary labor. It was cut almost entirely from a single natural outcrop of limestone that was left standing in the quarry floor while the builders removed the stone around it. The Sphinx did not rise, it was revealed. The ancient workers peeled away everything that was not the Sphinx, and what remained was this. The body is that of a lion reclining at rest, with great forepaws stretched forward across the stone and the long, powerful haunches folded beneath. The lion was the supreme symbol of royal strength in ancient Egypt, and a crouching lion at the threshold was a guardian, patient and watchful, a presence that could not be moved or frightened or turned aside. And upon that lion's body rests the head of a man, and most scholars who have studied the proportions and the details of the face believe that it is almost certainly the face of the pharaoh Khafre, son of Khufu, who built the second of the 3 great pyramids that stand nearby. The Sphinx gazes out from the chin of Khafre's face with something in its expression that is difficult to name. Not fierce, not cold, serene perhaps, patient in a way that only stone can be patient. It faces due east, precisely east, so that on the mornings of the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun rises exactly between the outstretched paws, as if the Sphinx itself is conducting the ritual of each new day. This was not accident. The ancient Egyptians were careful watchers of the sky, and the sun was among the most sacred of their concerns. The Sphinx does not merely guard the plateau, it greets the dawn. Every morning for 4,500 years, the first light of the rising sun has fallen on that wide stone face, and the Sphinx has received it without surprise, without hurry, in perfect stillness. When it was new, it would have looked quite different than it does today. The limestone from which it was carved is a soft and varied stone, and when it was freshly cut, it was clean and pale, almost cream-colored in the bright desert light. But more than that, the ancient Egyptians painted their monuments, and the Sphinx was painted too. The traces are faint now, weathered away by wind and time in the long, dry centuries, but close examination of the stone reveals what remains of pigment in the sheltered creases. The face was painted red, the warm reddish ochre that the Egyptians used for men's skin in their art, and there were traces of blue and yellow elsewhere, of the bright mineral colors the ancient craftsmen ground from stone and mixed into their paints. The headdress, the nemes, the striped cloth that falls from the crown to the shoulders would have been painted in those strong, clear colors. The Sphinx we see today, worn and soft-edged and the color of old bone, is a different thing from the Sphinx that the ancient people saw, gleaming and vividly colored in the desert sun. But perhaps the older version is more beautiful in its way, because it carries the marks of all those years, all that time, written gently across its face. Think for a moment about what it meant to walk toward the Sphinx in its earliest days, when the quarry had been only recently cleared, and the enormous figure still gleamed with fresh paint. You would have been approaching along a stone causeway that connected the valley below to the plateau above, a roofed and colonnaded corridor that channeled visitors upward toward the sacred precinct of the pyramid complex. The Sphinx sat at the eastern end of this approach, just beside the Valley Temple of Khafre, a low and massively built structure of pink granite that still stands in large part today. The whole arrangement was deliberate and carefully considered. The Valley Temple, the causeway, the mortuary temple, the pyramid, and the Sphinx formed a single connected sacred landscape, a geography of death and transformation and eternal kingship. The Sphinx was not a separate thing dropped into the landscape by chance. It was part of a plan, part of a vision of how the world should look around the tomb of a god-king. Standing outside the Valley Temple in those early days, you would have looked up and seen the Sphinx from below, from a lower vantage point than the plateau, and at that angle the head would have appeared to rise enormous above the edge of the quarry, the painted face catching the morning light. The rising sun at your back, the great face before you, the pale limestone cliffs of the plateau rising on either side. It would have been an overwhelming sight, designed to be overwhelming, designed to make you feel small and temporary in the presence of something vast and permanent. The pharaohs' builders understood the power of scale. They used it deliberately, as skillfully as they used stone and mathematics and the careful placement of shadows. There is also the nose, or rather the place where the nose was. The nose of the Great Sphinx has been gone for centuries, a fact that every visitor notices and that most people at some point have wondered about. It is a large absence. The nose would have been tall and broad, befitting the scale of the whole face, and without it the expression of the Sphinx is subtly altered, a little softer, a little more ambiguous perhaps. Many stories have been told about how it was lost, and the most persistent of those stories, the one that has circulated most widely in the modern world, lays the blame on the soldiers of Napoleon, who are said to have used the Sphinx as target practice when the French army came to Egypt at the end of the 18th century. But this is almost certainly not what happened. A medieval Arab historian, writing centuries before Napoleon was born, already described the nose as damaged and gone. The true cause is lost to time, as so many things are. It may have been chiseled away deliberately by a religious reformer who saw something troubling in the worship the Sphinx received. It may have been shaped by centuries of desert weather. Whatever the reason, the nose is gone, and the Sphinx keeps its own counsel about the matter, saying nothing, as it has said nothing about everything else. But there is another feature of the Sphinx that speaks to us, not in stone alone, but in words. Between the great outstretched paws, sheltered from the wind and the drifting sand, there stands a slab of carved pink granite. It is called the Dream Stele, and the story it tells is one of the most beautiful in all of ancient Egypt. Let it settle over you gently now. The story begins perhaps 1400 years after the Sphinx was carved, in the time of a new kingdom prince named Thutmose. He was a younger son of the pharaoh, not the expected heir, and his place in the great order of things was uncertain. One day he came to the plateau at Giza to hunt in the desert around the pyramids, and when the heat of the day grew heavy and the light turned to bronze, he lay down in the shadow of the Sphinx to rest. At that time, the Sphinx was largely buried. The desert sand had crept up around it, drifted against it, settled over the centuries until only the head and perhaps a little of the shoulders rose above the great pale expanse of the plateau. The body was gone, swallowed by the dunes, and the face looked out from its collar of sand like a head emerging from a pool of still water. The young prince slept in the shade, and as he slept, he dreamed, and in the dream, the Sphinx spoke to him. It spoke as a god, for the Egyptians saw the Sphinx as a form of the sun god, calling it Hormakhit, Horus on the horizon, the great solar presence that held the eastern sky at dawn. And in the dream, the Sphinx asked the prince for a gift. The sand had buried it, the great body was imprisoned beneath the weight of the desert, and it had lain there for a very long time, and it was asking, in the gentle way of dreams, to be freed, and it made a promise in return. If the prince would clear away the sand, if he would dig the Sphinx free and restore it and honor it as it deserved to be honored, then the god would give him something in return. The throne of Egypt, the double crown, the rule of the two lands. When he woke from his dream, the prince carried it close, as one does with dreams that feel different from ordinary ones. And in time, Thutmose became pharaoh, Thutmose IV, and one of his first acts as ruler was to order the clearing of the Sphinx. The sand was excavated, the great body revealed again, the paws and the haunches and the reclining form brought back into the open air and the light. And between the paws he placed the dream stele, the granite slab, recording the dream and the promise and the gift that had been given and received. We can read that inscription today. The stone was carved and set there by Thutmose's command, and it has stood in that sheltered place between the paws ever since, recording a dream that a young man had one warm afternoon more than 3,000 years ago, a dream of a god asking to be remembered, asking to be seen. It is one of the most human things in all of Egypt's long history, a dream, a promise, a son who was not quite expected to be king, who lay down tired in a shadow and woke to find his life changed. The clearing of the sand by Thutmose was not the last time the Sphinx would be dug free. This is perhaps the strangest and most melancholy aspect of its long life. The sand was always returning. The desert has its own patience equal to the Sphinx's, and it does not hurry. It comes a grain at a time, carried on the north wind, settling into the sheltered corners, climbing the sides of the paws, slowly filling back in. Within a few centuries of each clearing, the Sphinx might be buried again to the neck or deeper. And so the freeing and the burying alternated over and over through the long centuries. The New Kingdom pharaohs cleared it. Later it was buried again. Medieval travelers came to see the enormous head jutting from the sand and wrote about it with wonder, noting the features, remarking on its size, making the same kinds of observations that visitors make today, reaching for words large enough to hold the impression it left on them. And still the sand returned. It was not until the early 20th century that a systematic and thorough excavation was undertaken, and the entire Sphinx was finally cleared and stabilized, the great body fully revealed for what may be the first uninterrupted period in its history since the days of the Old Kingdom. Even now, the restoration and preservation of its soft limestone requires patient, ongoing care, for the stone is always weathering, always slowly yielding to wind and moisture in the long work of time. There are things about the Sphinx we do not know, and perhaps will never know. We do not know exactly why it was made. It stands near the pyramid of Khafre, and the face appears to be Khafre's face, and so the most reasonable explanation is that it was carved as part of the great royal complex, a guardian of the plateau and of the tomb, a solar symbol facing the east to greet the god. But the ancient Egyptians did not leave written instructions for us. They left the thing itself, and the thing speaks in a language that is older than words. We do not know precisely how the ancient craftsmen organized the work of carving it, how many men, what tools, how long it took. We can reason from the evidence, from what we know of Egyptian construction methods and the marks of copper chisels in old stone, but the exact truth of those working days is gone. Imagine them, though, if you will, the men standing in the quarry with their stone hammers and copper tools in the bright heat of the 4th dynasty, 4,500 years ago, carefully cutting away the limestone that surrounded the crouching shape, bringing forward the haunches, the paws, the smooth curve of the chest, the face with its serene and attentive expression. The sun beating down on their backs, the dust of pale limestone in the air, the slow, gradual emergence of something enormous from the rock that held it. What is also remarkable is the nature of the stone itself. The plateau at Giza is not uniform. The limestone that forms it was laid down in shallow ancient seas over millions of years, and different layers of it have different qualities, different hardnesses and compositions. The upper body of the Sphinx, and the head especially, is carved from a harder, more durable layer, and those parts have weathered comparatively well over the millennia. But the lower portions of the body were cut from softer, more crumbly limestone, and those sections have suffered more from wind and moisture over the long centuries. The stone tells a geological story as well as a human one, and the Sphinx, read closely, is a record of what the Earth was doing here long before there were people to notice. The weathering of the stone has led to some interesting and lively debates among researchers over the decades. Some have looked at the patterns of erosion on the lower body and suggested that they resemble the kind of damage done by flowing water, which would imply that the Sphinx was carved at a time when this part of the world received much more rainfall than it does today. The Egyptian climate was indeed wetter in the distant past, thousands of years before the pyramids were built, in a period sometimes called the African Humid Period or the Green Sahara, when grasslands covered much of what is now desert. But most Egyptologists who have examined the evidence carefully believe that the weathering of the Sphinx is consistent with the geological and climatic conditions of the Fourth Dynasty, and that the monument fits well within the known history of that period. The question is not fully closed, and perhaps it never will be, because the stone is old enough and the climate history complicated enough that certainty is hard to come by. But the best reading of the evidence places the Sphinx firmly in the age of the pyramid builders, in the time of Khafre, as has long been understood. We do not know exactly what the ancient Egyptians made of their own wonder when the work was done and they stepped back from it in the completed quarry and saw it whole for the first time. But we can guess at something of what they felt because we feel it too. There is something about the Sphinx that is larger than its explanation. Even knowing the history, even understanding the geology and the archaeology and the symbolism, when you stand before it, the scale and the age and the expression of the thing produce something that is not quite a thought. It is more like a recognition. Something in us responds to it across all the distance of time. And perhaps that is what the ancient builders understood, though they would have named it differently. They did not think in terms of aesthetic experience or historical significance. They thought in terms of the sacred, the powerful, the enduring. They were making something that would outlast anything perishable, something that would stand at the eastern edge of the plateau and greet the sun, while the great pyramid tombs held their dead kings in the dark behind it, something that would persist through seasons and floods and the long turning of the world. They were right, it has. The desert around the Sphinx is quieter now than it was in the days of the pharaohs. The city that grew up nearby is enormous and modern and vivid, and on most days it can be seen and heard from the plateau. But at certain hours in the early morning before the visitors come, or in the late evening after they have gone, the plateau settles into something like its old silence. The sand is still pale and fine. The wind still moves across it in the same patterns it has always moved. And the Sphinx sits as it has always sat, facing east, patient as the stone it is made from, with the long morning shadow of the pyramids stretching across the plateau behind it, and the glow of the coming sun beginning to warm the sky above the horizon. It has seen so much, the flowering and the passing of one of the great civilizations in human history, the Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, who came to visit the already ancient Sphinx as pilgrims and left offerings between its paws, the Greeks and Romans who came later and were awed by it, who called it by the name that has stayed with it into our own time, the Arab scholars of the medieval centuries who described the head above the sand and puzzled over its origin and its meaning, the great expeditions of the 18th and 19th centuries that measured and sketched it, the 20th century archaeologists who cleared the sand for the last time and began the patient work of preservation that continues today. Across all of those ages, the face did not change its expression. Whatever was written in it when the craftsmen finished their work is still written in it now, a little softened by the wind, a little worn at the edges, but still there. Consider for a moment the full span of what those eyes have overlooked. When the Sphinx was carved, the written history of Egypt was already several centuries old. The great administrative system of the pharaohs, the hieroglyphic script, the elaborate theology of the gods, all of this was already established and functioning when Khafre's craftsmen raised their tools to the stone. The Sphinx was born into a world that already felt ancient to the people who lived in it. And yet by the time the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt died, more than 2,000 years after the Sphinx was made, the monument was already as remote in time from those later Egyptians as the later Egyptians are from us. The Romans who came as tourists, who left inscriptions on the rocks of the plateau, who wrote home about the wonders of Egypt, were looking at something that was to them what the Romans themselves are to us now. Very old, astonishing, almost incomprehensible in its age. The Greek historian Herodotus came to Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, and even he was already looking at something ancient. He describes the pyramids in detail, marvels at their size, records the stories the Egyptian priests told him. Whether he wrote directly about the Sphinx is uncertain, since the passages are not entirely clear, but the monument was there when he walked the plateau, already worn and already half-buried, already a symbol of a past that felt remote even to the Egyptians of his own time. It has been old for a very, very long time. There is comfort in this if you let yourself feel it. The Sphinx has waded through every kind of human time, through abundance and scarcity, through discovery and forgetting, through the long rise and fall of great powers, and it is still here. It has outlasted the civilization that made it by more than 2,000 years, and still it watches the east and receives the morning sun. The desert night, when it comes, is very dark and very still. The stars over the Giza Plateau are the same stars the ancient Egyptians watched, and they gave them names and stories and placed their dead kings among them. The Sphinx sits beneath that turning sky, dusted faintly with starlight, the pale stone glowing a soft silver in the dark. The wind moves over the sand without hurry. The night is cool and long and peaceful. You are not in the desert. You are here, warm and comfortable, and the night is quiet where you are too. But you can carry the image with you if you wish. The long plateau, the 3 great triangles of shadow against the stars, and at the edge of the quarry, facing east, the enormous patient figure that has been waiting there since long before any of us and will be waiting there long after, watching for the light that always comes back, as it always has, as it always will. The dream of the young Prince Thutmose settled over him in the warm shade of a long afternoon and left him changed. Let whatever you carry tonight settle just as gently. There is nothing you need to figure out in this hour. The Sphinx has been waiting 4,500 years, and it is still there and still patient, and the sun will rise tomorrow as it has always risen. Let your thoughts drift like fine sand on a slow wind, a little this way, a little that, growing lighter and slower until they settle. The stone face turned to the east, holding its long stillness, the cool of the night over the plateau, the stars above in their quiet turning, the deep silence that belongs to very old things, very large things, things that have learned to wait without effort, without strain, without need of anything at all. Rest now, sink slowly downward, the way the last warmth of the day sinks into old stone and holds there through the night, gentle and deep and without urgency. The Sphinx will keep its watch. You do not need to, simply let go and drift and sleep. Let yourself settle now, a little deeper into wherever you are resting. There is nowhere to go and nothing to decide. Only this quiet story, waiting for you in the dark, drifting toward you the way starlight drifts across a still and ancient desert. Tonight we are going to a valley. It lies on the western bank of the Nile, across the broad, slow river from the great city the Egyptians called Wasit and that we know today as Luxor. To reach it, you would travel through fields of sugar cane and a fringe of green that follows the water's edge. And then, quite suddenly, the green would end, and the desert would begin, and the world would turn to pale gold and ochre and silence. The cliffs here are high and bone-white in the sun, carved over millennia by wind and by time into shapes that line and fold and tower. And folded among them, hidden from the river, hidden from the road, hidden, the Egyptians hoped, from the eyes of the world, there is a narrow valley. It has no dramatic entrance. The ground is dry and broken. Chips of pale limestone crunch underfoot. The sky above is a hard and brilliant blue. This is the Valley of the Kings. For nearly 500 years, through the age that scholars call the New Kingdom, the great pharaohs of Egypt brought their dead here. It began with a king named Thutmose I, around 1500 years before the Common Era, and it continued through the reigns of the Seti kings and the long dynasty of the Rameses and many others besides. Each king in turn commissioned a tomb cut into the living rock of these cliffs, a long descending corridor leading down through chambers and halls and antechambers, all of it carved and painted and prepared for the life that every Egyptian believed came after death. 63 royal tombs are known to be here, perhaps more still wait beneath the dust. The shift away from pyramids had been a practical one, though it carried its own quiet poetry. For 1,000 years before this time, the great kings of Egypt had buried their dead beneath monuments that announced themselves to the world, stone peaks rising from the flat desert plain, visible for miles, impossible to mistake. And generation after generation, tomb robbers had found them. The pyramids proclaimed where the riches were. They were, despite everything, an invitation. And so the priests and the architects of the new kingdom made a different choice: secrecy instead of spectacle. A hidden valley instead of a pointed mountain. A door cut into rock and sealed with stone and plastered over, with sand blown across it and the desert's silence covering it like a lid. It did not work, not entirely. Nearly every tomb in the valley was robbed in ancient times, most of them within a few centuries of being sealed. The priests themselves, in a later and more desperate age, gathered the mummies of the greatest kings and quietly moved them to a single hidden cache not far away to protect what little remained. When that cache was found in the modern era, the rescuers discovered kings lying together in the dark, great Rameses II among them, wrapped in linen, quietly waiting through 3,000 years. But we will return to the living valley. Close your eyes if you have not already, and let us walk down into it in the long, slanting light of late afternoon. The heat in this valley is extraordinary. The pale cliffs hold the sun's warmth long after the sun has shifted, radiating it back at you from every face of rock. In the depths of summer, the temperature here can climb far above what feels possible, and even in the cooler months there is a quality to the air, a dry, ancient stillness that makes you feel you are breathing something older than you can quite account for. The smell of it is dust and warm stone, with nothing else at all, no water, no green thing, no animal, only the dry mineral breath of the earth. The workers who built these tombs knew this valley intimately. They were a community, a village of craftsmen who lived nearby in a place called Deir el-Medina, and they walked this path every day of their working lives. We know more about them than we know about almost any ordinary people of the ancient world, because they were literate men who wrote things down, letters and accounts and complaints and love notes, scratched onto flakes of limestone or fragments of pottery that have survived in the dry desert air. They argued about wages. They went on strike, in what may be the first recorded labor strike in human history, when their rations were late. They told each other stories. They grieved their dead. They worshipped their own local gods in small chapels they built and painted themselves with the same care and skill they brought to the royal tombs, because they understood, as few people in any age have understood quite so viscerally, that beauty offered to the divine is never wasted. They were, in every recognizable way, people like us, going to work each morning into the stone mouth of a cliff to paint images of eternity. And the paintings they left are extraordinary. Step into one of the larger royal tombs and let the long corridor draw you down. The walls close in around you as you descend, and every surface has been prepared with plaster and covered with paint in colors that, in this dry and airless dark, have barely faded across 30 centuries. The background is often a deep warm gold or the rich amber of candlelight, and against it move processions of figures in profile, the formal, elegant style the Egyptians used so beautifully, every line precise and purposeful. Here is the king making offerings to the gods. Here are the gods themselves, the jackal-headed Anubis, the ibis-headed Thoth, the great hawk of Horus. Here are the 12 hours of the night, each one depicted as a region with its own guardians, its own challenges, its own dangers that the traveling soul must navigate by knowledge and by the correct recitation of certain powerful words. Here are the great serpents of the deep, and the boats of the sun moving through underground waters, and the scales on which a heart is weighed against the feather of truth. The walls are not merely decorative, they are functional. They are the map and the magic and the prayer all at once, pressed into stone, because stone endures, and what is written in stone remains available forever, or near enough to forever that the difference hardly matters. Deeper in the tomb, past the antechambers, lay the burial hall, and there the great stone sarcophagus rested, and within it the coffins, nested one inside the other like a set of perfectly fitted vessels, each one more intimate than the last, and at the center, wrapped in linen, the body of the king, prepared with such care, such tenderness, that it might survive the long wait and be ready when the time came to live again. The Egyptians did not fear death, they prepared for it. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this valley, about all of this great effort of stone and pigment and ceremony. The tombs were not dug in grief, they were built in hope. Every painted wall was an act of faith, a confident assertion that the soul would travel through the darkness and emerge into light, that the dead king would rise like the sun rose, that life was not a single thing with a single ending but a cycle, as reliable as the flooding of the Nile, as certain as the morning. And now let us come to the story within the story, the one that captured the world. Among the 63 royal tombs of the valley, nearly all of them were known. They had been entered in ancient times or by the early European travelers who came to Egypt in the age of exploration. Many had been stripped bare. The archaeologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries had mapped the valley with care and growing thoroughness, and by the years after the first of the Great World Wars, it was widely believed that there was nothing left to find. The valley had given up its secrets. There was one man who disagreed. His name was Howard Carter, and he was an Englishman who had spent most of his adult life in Egypt, first as an artist and illustrator, and then as an excavator of the patient, methodical kind. He was not a glamorous figure. He was precise, somewhat stubborn, exacting in his standards, a man who trusted careful work above all things. He had come to believe that one royal tomb had never been found, that one small and obscure king had been buried somewhere in the valley, and that the valley, despite everything, was still keeping one secret. The king's name was Tutankhamun. He was, by most measures, a minor figure. He had come to the throne as a boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years of age, at a turbulent moment in Egyptian history, following the strange and controversial reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who had upended religion and moved the capital, and disrupted the ancient order in ways that his successors spent years trying to undo. Tutankhamun ruled for about 9 years, and he died when he was perhaps 18 or 19 years old. The causes of his death are still gently debated by scholars who have studied his mummy with great care and found evidence of a leg broken not long before the end, among other things. He left no children who survived. He was succeeded by older men who had served his court, and within a generation or two his name had been partially erased from the records, his memory absorbed into a general attempt to forget the troubled years he had been born into. He was remembered barely as a name on a fragmentary list. Howard Carter, working with the financial support of a wealthy English lord named George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had been digging in the valley for years, systematically clearing areas that had not been properly examined, finding small things, workmen's huts, fragments, nothing that made the world take notice. Lord Carnarvon was patient and generous and genuinely curious, a man who had come to Egyptology later in life and embraced it with the enthusiasm of someone who has found a subject equal to his attention. But even his patience had limits. By 1922, he had decided that the next season would be the last. If nothing was found, the work would stop. Carter began digging in early November of that year, in an area he had left deliberately for last. On the 4th of November, a young water boy working at the site struck something solid beneath his digging stick. He uncovered a stone step. Carter, when he was called, recognized immediately what it might be and had the entire area cleared with care. By the following afternoon, a stairway of 16 steps had been uncovered, cut cleanly into the bedrock, leading down to a sealed doorway of plastered stone. On the plaster were the impressions of ancient seals. Carter could see, as he examined them in the afternoon light, the outline of a jackal crouching above 9 kneeling figures, the seal of the royal necropolis. Someone of importance was here. He sent word to Lord Carnarvon, who was in England. He waited. That waiting, by any measure, must have been one of the more remarkable exercises in self-restraint in the history of archaeology. Carter knew what might lie beyond that door. He had spent years in quiet, stubborn pursuit of exactly this possibility. And yet he sealed the stairway back up again, had the site guarded, and did not move a single stone until his patron arrived. The patience that had sustained him through years of finding nothing was still intact when finding something seemed almost certain. When Carnarvon arrived, the two men descended together and the door was carefully opened. Beyond it was a long descending passage filled with rubble, which took several days to clear, and at the end of the passage, another sealed door. On the afternoon of the 26th of November, 1922, Howard Carter made a small hole in the upper left-hand corner of that second sealed door. He inserted a candle and leaned close to the opening, and after a moment's hesitation, he held it to the gap and peered through. He said afterward that at first he could see nothing, for the warm air escaping from the sealed chamber made the candle flame flutter and the light waver. But as his eyes adjusted, details began to emerge from the darkness. Strange animals, statues, glints of gold seemingly everywhere, the gleam of it catching the small flame and returning it from every corner of the room beyond. He stood there for what felt like a long time without speaking, so that Lord Carnarvon, waiting behind him, asked quietly whether he could see anything. Yes, Carter said, wonderful things. What he was looking at was the antechamber of the tomb of Tutankhamun, and it had lain sealed and untouched for more than 3,000 years. The room was perhaps 8 paces long by 4 paces wide, and it was so full of objects that there was barely space to stand. Gilded ritual couches in the form of animals, their necks stretched long, their eyes wide in the candlelight, shrines and chests inlaid with ivory and ebony, alabaster vases and painted pottery, the disassembled pieces of golden chariots. Bundles and boxes and neatly stacked vessels, all of it crowded together in a kind of organized abundance, as though someone had been in the middle of packing for a long journey and had simply closed the door and walked away 3,000 years before. They did not rush. Carter, true to his nature, insisted on the most meticulous approach possible. Every object had to be cataloged and photographed and conserved before it could be moved, because the objects were fragile, many of them, ancient wood and linen and gilded surfaces that had never been exposed to air since the day they were placed there, and he was not going to let haste damage what 3,000 years of careful darkness had preserved. He brought in conservators and specialists. He built a field laboratory. He worked in the heat of the valley with a steady, almost devotional care, treating each object as what it was, something that had been placed there for a king and kept safe by time and accident in the desert's dryness, and that now passed, very slowly, back into the world. It took a decade in the end to fully clear the tomb. 10 years of patient work, recording and documenting more than 5,000 individual objects, each one a thread in the great cloth of a life prepared for eternity. But the heart of it, the thing that the world has never quite stopped thinking about, was what lay beyond another sealed doorway within the tomb. Through the antechamber and past a smaller room that Carter called the treasury, and through another door was the burial chamber itself, and in it stood 4 gilded wooden shrines, each one nested inside the next like a set of enormous boxes. And inside the innermost shrine stood the great stone sarcophagus, and within the sarcophagus were 3 coffins, one inside the other, the outermost 2 of gilded wood in the innermost, the one that held the king himself, made entirely of solid gold. The golden mask that covered the head and shoulders of the mummy has become one of the most recognized images in all of human history. It shows a young face, calm and beautiful, with the striped headdress and the formal features of a pharaoh in full ceremonial glory, the eyes lined with lapis lazuli and obsidian, the brows and the headdress inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones. It is at once the face of a specific young man who lived and died 3,000 years ago, and something that seems to transcend any one life, a face that looks back at you across the full depth of time with a strange and untroubled serenity. There is a story that gathered around the discovery in the years that followed, the story of the curse. It began with the death of Lord Carnarvon, who died in Cairo in the spring of 1923, some months after the tomb was opened. He had been bitten by a mosquito, and the bite became infected, and a fragility already present in his health made the infection fatal. He was 57 years old. The newspapers of the time, which had been following the discovery with great excitement, took hold of the coincidence and wove it into a story. There had been an ancient inscription, some accounts claimed, warning of death to those who disturbed the king's rest. Lights had gone out across Cairo at the moment of Carnarvon's death. His dog, back in England, had howled and then was still. These details, told gently, grew in the telling, as such stories always do. Howard Carter himself, who had been closer to the tomb than anyone, lived for another 17 years, dying in 1939 at the age of 64. Most of those involved in the excavation lived out ordinary lifespans. The curse, as these things go, was a story that people needed more than the facts required. But perhaps what made the story so willing to be believed was the feeling that the discovery carried with it from the very beginning. the sense that something very old and very serious had been entered. That in pressing your eye to a hole in a plaster door 3,000 years sealed, you were crossing a threshold that had been drawn with purpose, that the darkness on the other side was not simply empty space, but something weighted with the intentions and the hopes and the grief of people who had placed it there with their whole hearts. The Egyptians took the boundary between the living and the dead very seriously indeed. They spent their whole civilization preparing for it. And there is something in us that recognizes that seriousness, that feels the quiet gravity of it, even now, even from the far side of the centuries. What the intact tomb of Tutankhamun gives us in the end is not the story of a great king. He was not a great king in the way that Ramesses II was a great king, not in the way that the builders of the earlier dynasties shaped the world. He was a boy who became pharaoh by accident of birth, who ruled a country still finding its footing, who did some modest good and then died young, and whose name was nearly erased entirely. What his tomb gives us is a window. Because nearly every other royal tomb in the valley had been robbed, we had never truly seen what these burials looked like when they were intact. We knew the tombs with their painted walls, their long descending corridors, their empty stone sarcophagi, but we did not know what had filled them. We did not know the full extent of the care and the craft and the sheer abundance of what the Egyptians provided for their dead. Tutankhamun's tomb, modest by royal standards, still held more than 5,000 objects. The great royal tombs of Ramesses and Seti and the others must have held wonders we can only begin to imagine. Every alabaster lamp, every gilded couch, every shrine and chest and ritual vessel in that crowded antechamber tells us something about what the Egyptians believed the next life would require. The chariots, because one might wish to ride. The food and the wine, because hunger and thirst do not simply stop at the border between worlds. The beautiful things, because beauty matters wherever you find yourself. The prayers and the sacred text on the walls, because the journey is long and the words may be needed along the way. All of it laid in with such seriousness, such love, such confident and unhurried provision. They were not preparing a grave, they were packing for a departure. And this perhaps is the thing that this quiet valley in the desert holds, beneath all the gold and all the history and all the careful archaeology. A belief so deep it was carved in stone and painted in color and sealed behind plaster doors for 30 centuries. A belief that the dead are not simply gone, that the darkness is not permanent, that the sun that sets in the west each evening, as it sets now over that pale valley in its bowl of cliffs, is already on its way around to rising again on the other side of the night. Nile still runs on the other side of those cliffs. The fields are still green along its banks, even where the desert waits at the edge of every cultivated thing. The valley is quieter now than it once was in the busy years of excavation, though visitors still come, still descend those old stone stairs, still walk the long painted corridors and feel, perhaps, something of what Howard Carter felt when he pressed his eye to the gap in that plastered door, and the small flame steadied and the gold began to glow. 63 tombs in that dry hillside, and each one a life's preparation for what comes after. Each one a door that someone sealed with the hope that the sealed thing would survive, and that the dead would find what had been provided for them, and that the morning would come again on the other side of the long dark, each one a small, solemn argument against the permanence of darkness. And perhaps that is not the worst kind of argument to carry with you as you settle towards sleep, the old Egyptian confidence that what goes down into the dark will, in its own good time, return. Let the painted walls grow soft and distant now. Let the gold dim slowly the way firelight dims. Let the pale cliffs recede into the darkness behind your eyes. The valley is quiet tonight as it has been quiet for thousands of years. The stars above it are the same stars that the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina looked up at as they walked home in the evenings, their brushes put away, the tomb growing behind them in the dark, their work done for another day. You have seen wonderful things tonight. Now let yourself drift slowly, without effort, the way the river moves in the quiet hours before dawn. Let the warmth of the old desert hold you gently. Let the long silence of the valley fold around you like linen, like gold, like the soft and patient dark, and let yourself go peacefully into sleep. There is a river that has been flowing longer than memory reaches, longer than any name we have given it, longer than the oldest walls of the oldest cities that ever rose along its banks. It runs from the deep heart of Africa all the way to the shore of a warm and ancient sea. and it does something that seems almost to defy the ordinary way of things. It flows not south but north, winding upward through stone and sand and silence until it spreads itself open like two open hands and meets the Mediterranean. Tonight we follow that river. We let its slow and silver current carry us, and we rest our thoughts on its green and gentle shores. There is nothing here to hurry toward. The river has been moving at this same patient pace for longer than any of us can hold in our minds, and it will go on moving long after this night is done. Let the words wash over you the way the river washes over the stones at its edge, unhurried, cool, and deep, and let yourself begin softly to drift. This is the story of the Nile. Picture, if you can, the northeastern corner of Africa as it was 4,000 years ago, or 5,000 or more. From above, if some quiet bird had circled high enough on a warm thermal to see the whole sweep of the land, it would have looked like a world made of only two colors. There was the deep pale ochre of the desert, stretching in every direction, seemingly without end, without feature, without water or shade, an ocean of red and gold that swallowed the horizon on every side. And cutting through that desert, impossibly, improbably, startlingly, there was a ribbon of green. Just a ribbon, a thin and shining thread of life drawn through the emptiness, no wider in places than a person could walk across in an easy morning, and yet blazing with a richness that must have seemed almost miraculous against the surrounding waste. Palm trees and sycamores and willows leaning over the water, sedge and papyrus nodding in the breeze along the banks, herons standing motionless in the shallows, their long necks curved in patient thought. Ibises picking their way through the mud at the river's edge, their curved dark beaks dipping and lifting in a slow and steady rhythm. Wild geese calling across the water at first light, and in the channels between the reeds, the quick silver flash of fish. This ribbon, this thread, was the Nile, and it was everything. Without it, there would have been no Egypt. That is not a romantic exaggeration. It is the plain and simple truth of the place. The desert on either side was not merely difficult, it was lethal. It had no water, no food, no shelter, no mercy. The people who first came to this valley and stayed were people who had found, in that great emptiness, the one place where life was possible, and they had the wisdom to remain. The river gave them water to drink, land to farm, fish to catch, reeds to weave into baskets and boats, mud to make into bricks, and a road that ran from the deep south to the northern sea. It gave them, in short, everything they needed to build a civilization, and for 3,000 years they built one. The old Greek traveler Herodotus, who came to Egypt as a curious visitor and was astonished by what he found, described the country in 5 words that have stayed with us ever since. Egypt, he wrote, is the gift of the river. He was not wrong. The Nile is, by many reckonings, the longest river in the world. It rises in the deep south from 2 great sources that merge and become one. One branch, the White Nile, begins far south in the highlands around the Great Lakes of Central Africa and makes its long and meandering way northward through swamps and savannas, collecting water along the route, patient and wide and pale. The other branch, the Blue Nile, is born in the cool mountains of Ethiopia, in a highland lake that catches the summer rains of the monsoon, and it tumbles down from those heights through gorges and cataracts, fast and brown with silt. The 2 branches meet far south of Egypt, and from that meeting they flow on as one, the combined river running northward through Sudan and into Egypt, through desert and rock, and finally through the flat and fertile delta, spreading at last into the sea. For a very long time, no one in Egypt knew where the river came from. No one knew why it rose and fell. No one had traced it to its distant sources in those green southern highlands. The river simply was, as the sun was, as the sky was, as the stars were. It had always been there. It was older than any god they named, and each year it performed its miracle. Each summer the Nile rose. No one watching from the banks of Egypt had any way to know that far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the season had brought its great rains. They could not see the storms gathering above those distant mountains, the water thundering down the steep valleys and pouring into the river and swelling it beyond its banks. All they knew was what they could see, that the river, without apparent cause, without any rain falling on them, would begin to darken and thicken, to carry a heavy load of silt, and to rise. It would creep up over its banks and spread across the flat land on either side, filling in the low channels, pooling between the gentle undulations of the plain, covering the fields with a slow and spreading sheet of muddy water that shone in the sunlight like polished copper. It would lie there for weeks, that patient flood, soaking into the ground, settling its cargo of rich, dark sediment across the land. And then it would withdraw, leaving behind a thing of almost impossible value. A fresh layer of dark and fertile soil, thick with the minerals it had carried down from the distant mountains, ready to be planted and to yield. The Egyptians had a word for this annual flooding, Akhit. It was the first of their 3 seasons, the season of inundation, and they watched for it each year with a mixture of reverence and practical attention. Too little flood and the fields would not receive enough water or silt to grow good crops, and a lean year would follow. Too much flood and the water would reach the villages and the towns and wash away what could not be moved. The right flood was an answered prayer. And for most years, across most centuries, the river delivered what was needed. The soil the river left behind was almost black, dark and dense and rich in a way that soil has no business being in the middle of a desert. The Egyptians noticed its color and they named their country for it. They called it Kemet, which meant simply the black land. That dark stripe along the river's edge was their world, their home, their life. And beyond its last thin margin began what they called Deseret, the red land, the desert, a realm of danger and emptiness that they feared and respected and did not venture into without need. The boundary between the two was not gradual. It was sharp, almost impossibly so. A person could stand with 1 foot in the lush green of the farmed fields and 1 foot in the dry and lifeless sand. That line, so clear, so absolute, gave the Egyptians a particular way of thinking about the world. There was order and there was chaos, there was life and there was its absence, and the river was what held order in place. They organized their entire year around it. After Akhit, the time of flooding, came Perit, the time of growing, when the floodwaters had withdrawn and the planting could begin. Farmers waded into the softened black earth with their simple wooden plows, cutting furrows, dropping seed, guiding their slow oxen through the wet and fragrant fields while the sun climbed and the air filled with the calls of birds. And then came Shemu, the time of harvest, the long dry season when the grain was cut and gathered and stored, when the river ran low and quiet and the days were hot and still and golden. 3 seasons, each named for what the river did, each anchored to the slow and reliable pulse of the water. The Egyptians built gauges to measure the river's rise. These were marked columns or carved staircases set at the river's edge, or wells connected to the river by channels with measurements cut into the stone. Priests and officials would watch the water level each day during the inundation season and read its depth against the marks, comparing it to the records of past years, trying to forecast the harvest. A rise to one mark meant a good year. A rise to another meant abundance. A fall below a certain level meant worry. These devices were not grand monuments. They were practical tools, quiet and essential, the careful record-keeping of a people who understood that everything depended on the river's mood and who paid close attention. The spirit they named to that mood was gentle and generous in their imagining of him. Happy, the deity of the flood, was not shown as a fierce or powerful figure. He was depicted with a round belly and full cheeks, laden with gifts, carrying the papyrus plant in one hand and the lotus in the other, his body colored blue-green like water or the dark earth after it had drunk its fill. He was not a god who demanded fear. He was more like the embodiment of a kindness so constant and so life-giving that the people had given it a face, a name, and a form, so that they might address their gratitude to it directly. When the river came and the fields turned green, it was happy who had come, and the people gave thanks. Now let us walk down to the water's edge and feel the place. The bank of the Nile was alive in a way that is difficult to imagine if you have only known rivers in quieter lands. Here, where the water met the earth, there was a constant and gentle commotion of life. Papyrus grew in great stands along the margins of the river, their thick green stems rising twice the height of a person, topped with feathery heads that caught the light and rustled in the northerly breeze that blew along the water most afternoons. These reeds were among the most useful things the Egyptians knew. They made boats from bundles of them, lashing the stems tightly together into light and buoyant craft that could be pulled through the shallows or paddled out into the wider current. They made baskets and mats and sandals from the fibrous stalks. And from the pith at the center of the stem, sliced thin, laid in overlapping layers and pressed under weight, they made a writing surface so useful and so adaptable that the word for it passed through Greek and Latin into English and became the word we still use for the material we write on today. Fishermen worked the river from dawn to dusk. They cast nets from their small boats or set traps of woven reeds in the shallows or simply stood in the water with a line. The river was full, perch and catfish and tilapia, and the large and impressive Nile perch that could grow to a great size in the deeper channels. Fish fed the ordinary people through much of the year, dried and salted and stored, and the fishing boats moving out across the river at first light, with the mist still rising off the water and the herons standing motionless in the reeds, must have made one of the most peaceful and ordinary sights imaginable. Small and quiet and utterly human. Larger boats moved along the middle of the river, their single broad sails spread to catch the north wind that blew upstream, or their oars dipping and rising in steady rhythm when the wind fell. The Egyptians understood something beautiful about their river. The current always ran north toward the sea, but the prevailing wind almost always blew from the north upstream. So a traveler going south could simply raise a sail and let the wind carry them upriver. A traveler going north could lower the sail and let the current do the work. The river was, in this way, a road that ran in both directions, and the Egyptians used it as their highway, their postal route, their supply chain, their connection between the narrow valley communities and the great cities and the temples that sat at intervals along its banks like beads on a long and green string. These river craft are among the oldest images in Egyptian art. You see them painted on the walls of tombs, etched onto pottery, carved in low relief on the sides of temples. Long narrow boats with high curved prows and sterns, the single mast amidships, the sail broad and square. Crews of men bent over their oars or standing at the steering oar at the stern, keeping the bow pointed into the slow and easy current. And sometimes, under an awning stretched between two poles, you can see a passenger reclining in the shade, watching the banks go by, the fields of grain, the clusters of palms, the village walls gleaming white in the sun, the soft hills of the eastern desert rising blue in the distance. That river road connected everything. Stone quarried far to the south was floated down on great rafts to the pyramid sites near the capital. Grain harvested in the rich delta was shipped upstream to feed the workers in the temples and the courts of the kings. Incense and exotic wood and animal skins came upriver from distant southern lands, carried on trading ships that made the long journey to the farthest reaches of the Egyptian world and beyond. The Nile was not merely the country's water supply. It was its nervous system, the channel through which everything the civilization needed passed and flowed and moved. And on its banks the cities grew. They rose along the river like a necklace of life in the desert, each one dependent on the water, each one given over to the goods and the gods appropriate to its particular stretch of the valley. Memphis in the north, for a long age the great capital, sitting where the valley narrowed into the delta, commanding the junction between the upper country and the lower. Thebes far to the south, a city of temples so vast that travelers who came to it in the ancient world struggled to describe what they had seen. Abydos, the holy city, where the earliest kings were buried and where the cult of Osiris, lord of the dead and of the yearly return of life, held its deepest roots. And 100 smaller places between them, each with its own temple, its own priests, its own markets along the quay where the boats came and went on the brown and glittering water. What a thing it must have been to move along that river, through that valley, in those long ago centuries. To watch the land change around you as your boat drifted on the current. In the south the valley was narrow, the cliffs coming close on either side, the strip of green no more than a mile or two across, the desert looming above the fields and walls of orange stone. And as you moved northward the valley widened gradually, the floodplain broadening, the fields stretching further and further from the water until in the north, in the delta, the river split into many braided channels and spread across a wide and marshy plain before meeting the sea. Different landscapes, different weathers, different crops and birds and smells, all connected by the single long thread of the water. The smell of the river is something that words can only gesture at. There's the mud, always the mud, rich and mineral and dark, the smell of something immensely alive and ancient, the smell of the sediment that came down from the highland rains and settled here in the valley over tens of thousands of years to make this black and fertile soil. There's the green smell of the water plants, the papyrus and the reeds, the faint, cool sweetness of things that live close to water. There's the salt smell of the fish drying on racks in the midday sun, and the wood smoke of the cooking fires in the villages, and sometimes, when the wind shifted and came from the east, the dry and dusty breath of the desert just beyond the last green field. And over all of it, the light of Egypt along the Nile is particular, the light of a clear sky in a dry country, bright and white at noon, turning to deep gold in the late afternoon, painting the cliff faces above the river in colors of amber and rose and ochre, and and laying down long shadows across the fields as the sun dropped behind the western desert. The river caught that light and held it, throwing it back in rippling patterns across the hulls of the boats and the faces of the people on the bank. You can see that light in the paintings the Egyptians left behind, that clear, warm, golden light that seems to belong specifically to this place, this valley, this thin strip of life between the deserts. The people who lived along the river knew it the way a person knows a face they have loved for a long time. They knew the sound it made in different seasons, the deep and steady rush of the high water against the banks, the quieter murmur of the low water over the stones. They knew how the fish moved through the year, and where to find them in the heat of summer when they retreated to the deeper channels. They knew which plants were safe to eat along the margins and which were not. They knew that the crocodiles preferred the quieter backwaters and the shaded banks in certain stretches of the river, and they navigated accordingly. Children grew up swimming in the water and fishing from the bank. Old men sat in the shade of the palms and watched the boats go by. Women came to the edge in the early morning to fill their jars and carry them back on their heads through the fields to the village. The river was not exotic to them, not a wonder to be remarked upon. It was simply home. It was the ground of their existence, as ordinary and as indispensable as breathing. And yet, for all that ordinariness, it never stopped being something more. The Egyptians understood in a way that was instinctive and deep that the river was the reason they were alive, the reason their fields were green, the reason their children did not go hungry, the reason their cities could be built and their temples raised and their long and elaborate civilization sustained. They held that understanding in the form of ritual and religion and art, returned to it in their hymns and their prayers and the images they carved into the stone of their monuments. The river was not a backdrop to Egyptian life, it was its center, it was its meaning, it was the pulse that everything else was organized around. There is a passage in an ancient Egyptian text, a hymn of praise to the flood, that captures something of this feeling, though it must be heard at a remove of 4,000 years. It speaks of the flood as the one who comes and makes the fields laugh, who fills the granaries and gives breath to all cattle, who brings green things into being and provides for all. The words are formal and ceremonial, as such texts always are, but underneath the ceremony there is something genuine, something that reads across the centuries as a real and felt gratitude, the gratitude of a people who knew exactly what they owed to the water and were not too proud to say so. We owe something to the river ourselves, in a way. The civilization that grew along its banks gave the world so much: writing and mathematics, medicine and astronomy, architecture and engineering and art of extraordinary refinement. The monuments that still stand along the Nile today are among the most enduring things that human beings have ever made, more than 4,000 years old in some cases, still standing, still holding something of the life that was lived in their shadow. And all of that came from this narrow green thread between the deserts. All of that was made possible by the silt the river carried down from the Ethiopian highlands each summer and laid gently, year after year, across the black and waiting fields. When you think of Egypt, what comes first to mind may be the pyramids, or the golden mask of a young king, or the hieroglyphs carved deep into ancient stone. And those things are real and magnificent, but before any of them, before the first stone was cut, or the first king crowned, or the first god named, there was the river. Patient, northward running, annually flooding, endlessly generous, the Nile was there first. It made everything else possible. It was, as the old traveler said, the gift. And the people of that valley spent 3,000 years trying, in stone and paint and gold and prayer, to give something worthy back. Imagine standing on the bank of the Nile at dusk in that ancient time. The sun has gone behind the western cliffs, and the sky above them is the deep burning orange of a coal just before it cools to dark. The river is the color of hammered copper, flat and wide and very still. A heron lifts from the reeds at the water's edge and crosses the river in slow and deliberate wing beats, its shadow moving across the surface below it. Somewhere back in the fields, a dog is barking once, twice, and then quiet. The palm trees along the bank are still. The first stars appear in the darkening east, reflected faintly in the river below them as pale and trembling lights. And the river moves on, as it has always moved, as it will always move, carrying the dark water northward through the dark land, between the silences, between the stars. The Nile is still there, it still flows north, it still carries silt from distant mountains. The feluccas with their white sails still move along its surface in the afternoon wind, and the black land is still black, still fertile, still fed by the same slow and generous river that fed it when the first farmers laid their seed into the silt and and looked up at the blue sky and were grateful. Let all of that settle over you now like a warmth, like a stillness. The river is moving, the stars are above it. The long night has come down over the valley and the world is very quiet. There is nothing more to be done, nothing more to attend to. Only the sound of the water at the bank, the soft creak of a boat tied at the quay, the heron still and dark against the last color of the sky. You can rest now. Let the current carry you, gently and without effort, out into sleep. Settle in now and let the world outside grow very quiet. There is nothing pressing, nothing left undone that cannot wait until tomorrow. Let your breath slow and let your shoulders drop, and let us travel together across a very great distance, back through the soft layers of time to the warm banks of the Nile and the city the ancient Egyptians called the Southern City, the city of the scepter, the city that would one day become simply Luxor. This is the story of Karnak and Luxor, two temples and one sacred road, and together one of the most astonishing things that human beings have ever built. Close your eyes and imagine the air first. It is dry and warm, the particular warmth of a landscape that has known the sun for 10,000 years. There is a faint smell of dust and stone in the distant river, and overhead the sky is the deep, still blue that you find only in the desert, a blue so pure it seems almost solid. To the east, the Nile moves slowly southward, wide and green and patient. And here, on its eastern bank, the ground is flat and golden, and from across the water you can already see them, rising above the low palms and the pale rooftops of the modern city, the great stone pylons, the ancient gateways, catching the last of the afternoon light and holding it, warm and amber, against the deepening sky. These are among the oldest stones in the world, still standing in their proper place. And when you stand before them, even now, even in an age of cities and towers and all the wonders of the modern world, they have a way of making you feel very small and very young and very grateful for the quiet. The city the ancient Egyptians knew as Waset, the city the Greeks later called Thebes, was for many centuries the religious and political heart of the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever produced. It was not always so. In the earliest ages of Egyptian history, power and prestige belonged to cities further north, and Thebes was a regional town of modest importance. But when a line of kings from the south rose to reunite Egypt after a period of fragmentation, they brought with them their local god, and they brought him to Thebes, and from that moment forward, the city began its long ascent. The god was Amun. His name in the ancient Egyptian tongue meant the hidden one, and he was thought to be a god of invisible power, present in the wind and the turning of the seasons and the breath that moves through all living things. In time he was joined with Ra, the great sun god, and became Amun-Ra, king of the gods, the most powerful deity in all the Egyptian pantheon, and his earthly home was here, on this broad and sunlit plain beside the river. And so they built for him, king after king, reign after reign, for nearly 2,000 years. Each pharaoh raised something new, added something grander, set another stone in place. A sanctuary here, a hall there, a gateway beyond it, and then beyond that, another gateway still larger than the first. New avenues were laid out, new obelisks were raised, new shrines were added for lesser gods who dwelt in Amun's vast celestial household. The whole sprawling complex grew outward and inward at once, like rings spreading from a stone dropped in still water, each ring wider and more elaborate than the one before. What grew up over those 20 centuries was Karnak, the largest religious building that human beings have ever made. Let that settle for a moment. Not the tallest, not the most decorated, not the most famous, but the largest. The precinct of Amun-Ra alone covers more than 200 acres, and within that precinct there are temples and shrines and sacred lakes and processional ways and workshops and storerooms, and all the apparatus of a great religious institution that was, in its prime, far more than a place of worship. It was a city within a city, home to thousands of priests and administrators and craftsmen and servants, the wealthiest single estate in all of Egypt, with cattle and gardens and ships of its own, receiving tribute from across the empire and sending the will of the hidden god out into the world. We shall not try to take it all in at once. That would be too much, and the beauty of it is not in the taking in but in the slow wandering. So let us enter gently, the way the priests and pilgrims once did, through the front, and let the scale of it come to us in stages. The great first pylon stands before you, a massive gateway built of pale sandstone, so tall that from its base you must tilt your head far back to see the top, and even then the edge of it seems to cut the sky like a blade. Pylons were the ceremonial entrances that marked the boundary between the everyday world and the sacred world within, and this one was among the last to be added, so that Karnak grew from the inside outward over time, each new gateway placed further from the innermost sanctuary, pushing the boundaries of the holy ever wider. Slots in the masonry once held enormous flagstaffs, their tips wrapped in bright copper to catch the sun. The flags they flew are long gone, but the sockets for them remain, and standing before the great pylon you can imagine how it would have looked from the river, the colored pennants high against the blue, visible for miles across the flat valley floor. Pass through the pylon and you enter a wide outer courtyard open to the sky. There is a quality of light in these open spaces that is difficult to describe. It is not merely bright. It is deep and still and of a particular golden quality that seems to come from both above and below at once, as though the sunlight falling onto the pale stone is held there, concentrated, softened, and given back. You can feel the warmth of it on your face, even in your imagination, and it has a way of slowing the heartbeat and quieting the mind. Ahead of you lies the entrance to the great hypostyle hall. This is where Karnak gives itself to you in a single overwhelming moment, and it is the heart of what we have come to find. The hall was completed under the pharaohs Seti I and his son Ramesses II, those two great builders of the 19th dynasty, in the centuries around 1200 years before the Common Era, and what they built here is extraordinary by any measure. Imagine a covered hall so large that the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris could be set down inside it and still leave room to walk around the walls. The roof of it, which is now almost entirely gone, leaving the great columns open to the sky, was held up by 134 stone columns arranged in 16 rows. 134 columns. They do not feel like a number when you stand among them. They feel like a forest of stone, deep and quiet and dappled with the same kind of slow, shifting light you find beneath old trees when the sun is low. The columns are arranged so that the central two rows are taller than the rest, with openwork screens of carved stone set between the tall columns and the shorter ones, and through those openings the light falls in long, soft shafts, moving as the sun moves, warming the carved reliefs on the column faces one by one. The tallest columns, those in the central avenue, stand nearly 70 feet high, and they are so wide at the base that many people could stand together upon a single capital without crowding. Their tops are carved to resemble the great papyrus plant in flower, the open blossoms spreading at the crown of each shaft, and when these columns were new, those capitals were painted in brilliant color, blue and green and ochre and red, so that a visitor walking between them would have felt submerged in a garden built of stone and color and sacred intent. The carvings that cover every surface, ceiling and column and screen, are so dense and so fine that in places the whole wall seems to breathe. Stand still for a moment inside this imagined hall. Let your eyes adjust to the soft light. Let the columns recede into the distance in every direction, row upon row, their great drums of stone fitted with such precision that after 30 centuries the joints between them are still barely visible. Listen to the quality of the silence here. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of weight, of stone that has been standing long enough to absorb something of every prayer and every incantation, and every whispered name that has ever been spoken in its shadow. It is the silence of a place that has outlasted every one of the civilizations that rose and fell around it, that stood while empires came and passed, and are themselves now only names in the books of scholars. The people who built it and those who worshipped here were as real as you and I. Their scribes recorded the height of the Nile each summer. Their priests rose before dawn to wash themselves and recite the morning prayers that awaken the god in his innermost shrine. Their craftsmen spent entire careers carving the reliefs that cover the walls of this hall, standing on wooden scaffolding in the heat, driving their copper chisels into the stone with a mallet's careful strike, cutting the profiles of gods and kings into the surface one slow line at a time. They had names and families and houses on the streets of Thebes and opinions about their neighbors, and they built this, and it is still here, and in some quiet way it is the truest memorial any of them could have asked for. Beyond the hypostyle hall, moving deeper into the heart of the complex, you pass through further courtyards and through the remains of further gateways, and here the scale grows more intimate and the light takes on a different character, cooler and more enclosed. There are sanctuaries here that were dark by design, inner rooms where only the highest priests and the pharaoh himself might enter, lit only by small oil lamps, where the golden image of the god rested in its naos, a shrine within a shrine. The darkness was not forbidding. It was the darkness of mystery, of the hidden one in his hiddenness, and the lamps that burned within it were intended not to dispel the darkness, but to make it glow. Here, too, are the obelisks, the great stone needles that the Egyptians raised to mark sacred precincts and to commemorate the deeds of their sovereigns. Karnak once had several pairs, and some are still standing, some have fallen, and one was carried away to France in an earlier century and now stands in Paris far from its first home. But among those that remain, the most remarkable are a pair raised by one of the most fascinating figures in all Egyptian history, the woman pharaoh Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was one of ancient Egypt's most accomplished rulers. She governed not as a queen consort, but as pharaoh in her own right, wearing the double crown and the ceremonial beard of the pharaohs, leading trade expeditions, overseeing great building projects, directing the commerce that brought incense and ebony and living myrrh trees to Egypt's shores. She ruled for roughly 2 decades, and when she built at Karnak, she built on a grand scale. Her obelisks were among the tallest ever raised in Egypt, sheathed near their tops in a gleaming alloy of gold and silver called electrum, so that they caught the rising sun like torches and could be seen from far across the valley floor. One of them still stands, rising nearly 100 feet from its base, the inscriptions on its face still sharp enough to read after 3,500 years. When you look at it, you are looking at an act of devotion and an act of ambition at once, the two things inseparable, as they so often are in the human heart. She raised it, the inscription tells us, to honor Amen with electrum for his facade, to illumine the 2 lands like the sun disk. Whether she was moved more by faith or by the desire to be remembered, we cannot know. Perhaps, as with most great builders throughout history, she was moved by both in equal measure, and the stone does not distinguish between them. Outside the main temple enclosure, the land opens again, and here is something that carries its own particular kind of peace. The sacred lake. It is a large, rectangular body of still water, dug by the priests of Karnak to their own precise specifications, lined with stone, connected by channels to the Nile so that its level remained constant through the dry seasons. Every day before the rituals of the morning began, priests descended to the lake and bathed themselves in its waters, purifying themselves to stand in the presence of the divine. They believed the lake mirrored the primordial waters from which all creation had emerged, and that to bathe in it was to participate in the first morning of the world, the moment when the sun rose for the first time over the dark water and life began. Today the lake is still there. Its waters reflect the sky in the late afternoon and hold the image of the surrounding palm trees in long, wavering columns. Ducks sometimes rest on its surface. At the water's edge there is a large stone sculpture of a scarab beetle, the ancient symbol of renewal and resurrection, and it is said that if you walk 7 times around it in a circle, you will receive good fortune. Visitors follow the path today with smiling seriousness, and you wonder if the priests of Amen would have been amused or simply unsurprised, knowing as they did that human beings have always needed small rituals to make the world feel manageable. But the greatest of all the rituals that animated this complex was the Apit festival, and to understand it, we must look away from Karnak for a moment and look south, down the road that once ran beside the river. For Karnak was not alone. 2 miles to the south, connected to Karnak by a long ceremonial avenue, stands the Temple of Luxor, a separate great temple also dedicated to Amen, and also enlarged by many hands across many generations. The avenue between them, which the ancients knew as the Road of Rams, was lined on both sides for its entire length with stone sphinxes, not the lion-bodied and human-headed sphinx familiar from Giza, but a different form with the body of a lion and the head of a ram, the sacred animal of Amen. Hundreds of them crouching in 2 long rows, their stone eyes looking inward along the road, so that any procession that passed between them moved through a corridor of watching, patient stone. Much of that avenue is buried today beneath the accumulated centuries of the modern city, beneath roads and houses, and the life of a living town built directly upon the bones of the ancient one. But in recent years, archaeologists have traced the whole length of it, and in places you can walk along the newly uncovered paving and look out along the line of crouching rams extending away in both directions, and the effect is one of the most serene and solemn things that travel can offer. a road built not for ordinary walking, but for the measured movement of the sacred. And once a year in the time of the flood, when the Nile spread across the valley floor and turned the world briefly to water, the Opet festival made that road come alive. The festival lasted for weeks. It was the greatest celebration of the Egyptian year. From inside the innermost sanctuary of Karnak, the golden shrine of Amun-Ra was lifted by priests wearing white linen and carried out through the hall of columns, through the great courtyards, and out through the pylons into the day. The shrine was placed inside a sacred portable boat, a gilded wooden vessel shaped like a Nile barge, and lifted onto the shoulders of the priests. And then the procession moved. It moved to music. The priests and the pharaoh himself walked at the center of a great crowd, flanked by musicians playing drums and rattles in the sistrum, a kind of bronze instrument that made a dry, bright, shaking sound that the Egyptians associated with joy and divine presence. Dancers moved alongside, acrobats performed. Incense burned in great braziers, sending curling columns of smoke into the warm air. The people of Thebes lined the road, watching, celebrating, receiving food and drink distributed by the palace in the spirit of communal joy. The procession made its way south along the Avenue of Rams, or traveled by river in a golden barge rowed by priests while the crowds followed along the bank, and finally arrived at the Temple of Luxor, where rituals of renewal were performed that affirmed the sacred power of the pharaoh and the vitality of the god. The god rested at Luxor for a time, and then was carried back north in a second great procession. And when the golden shrine finally returned to its innermost sanctuary and the doors were closed, the festival was over for another year. Even now, reading of it from a distance of 3,000 years, you can feel the human warmth of it, the sense of a whole city coming together in something larger than individual life. It answers a need that does not belong to any particular time or place, the need to mark the turning of the year with ceremony, to say together that the divine is present, and to celebrate that fact simply by being present to it. Let us go back inside for one last walk before we leave. Let us return to the hypostyle hall in the hour before sunset, when the quality of the light is at its softest and most golden. The great columns cast their shadows long across the stone floor, and where the shafts of light fall through the open screens between the tall and short columns, the warm light seems almost solid, dense with dust motes drifting slowly downward. The carved reliefs on the column faces glow in the long light, the figures of gods and kings flattened and formal and yet somehow full of life, their hieroglyphic inscriptions winding around the column drums in careful rows, recording dedications and victories and divine encounters that were already ancient history by the time Rome was a city. Here is Amun in his feathered crown. Here is the pharaoh making an offering of incense. Here is a row of gods receiving their due. None of it feels like boasting here. It feels like memory, like the careful recording of a world that believed nothing was truly real unless it was carved in stone, and perhaps in a way that goes beyond belief they were right. These carvings have outlasted everything else those pharaohs built or thought or said or felt. The kings who carved their names here so that they would never be forgotten have not been forgotten. We know their names, we read their words, the stone held. The sun is lower now, and the warmth in the hall is taking on a different quality, softer and more amber, and the shadows between the columns have deepened. In this light, the forest of stone columns looks gentler, less overwhelming, more like a shelter than a statement. It is easy to understand why people came here. Not to be awed into submission, though the scale certainly accomplishes that, but to be held, to stand for a moment inside something so much larger and older and more permanent than themselves, and to feel in that standing something very like calm. There is a particular peace that very old and very large stone places give to the human body, and if you have ever stood in such a place, you will know it without needing it described. It is a bodily peace, a settling of the bones. The stone is cool, and the light is warm, and the silence has a weight to it, and you are simply there, without needing to be anywhere else. Karnak has been occupied, abandoned, reused, buried, excavated, and partly restored over many centuries. After the old religion faded and Christianity came to Egypt, some of the halls were turned into Coptic churches, and paintings of saints are still visible in some of the rooms, layered over the older gods like one long dream laid gently upon another. Later, after the old complex had fallen from use entirely, the sand of the desert moved in, drifting through the empty halls, rising against the columns, eventually burying the smaller structures in the lower portions of the great ones. The local people of Luxor built their houses directly upon and around the ruins, not knowing and perhaps not needing to know what lay beneath. Then the slow work of excavation began, and it continues today, every season uncovering more, every year restoring a little more of the avenue and the halls and the colonnades to something approaching their original form. It is painstaking and patient work, and the people who do it are in their way continuing the tradition of the craftsmen who built the place, putting in the long hours and the careful attention that very great things require. What we are left with is something between ruin and monument. The roof of the hypostyle hall is gone, and without it the columns stand under the open sky, which was not how they were intended to be seen, but which gives them their own austere beauty. Some of the obelisks are down and some still stand. The Avenue of Rams is partly buried and partly revealed. The sacred lake reflects a quieter world than the one the priests bathed in. And yet the essence of the place remains, undeniably, in the stone itself, in the carvings and the scale and the stillness that settles over you when you stand inside it. It is one of the places in the world where time does something unusual. It becomes difficult to hold on to. You stand among columns built 4,000 years ago, and they do not feel that remote. They feel like the present tense. The light falling between them is the same light that fell between them when they were new. The stone underfoot is the same stone. The sky overhead is the same sky. And the silence that gathers in the great hall at the end of the day is the same silence that gathered when the last priest made the last offering and closed the last door. And that perhaps is why we are drawn to these places in the end, not only because they are beautiful, though they are, not only because they are old, though they are very old indeed, but because they offer us a kind of rest from the passage of time, a sense that something persists, that the stone holds, that the light keeps returning each morning to the same carved faces and the same quiet halls. There is comfort in that persistence. It does not ask anything of us. It simply endures, and in enduring, it gives us something to rest against. The day is fading now over the valley of the Nile. The last of the light is leaving the top of the great pylon, and the columns are sinking into the blue shadow of evening. Somewhere across the river, beyond the cultivation, the cliffs of the western desert are turning rose and gold. The river moves, the birds settle. The city of Luxor, built on the bones of Thebes, goes about its evening in the way that cities have always done, with lights and voices and the ordinary business of people who live close to something extraordinary and have learned, as people do, to simply be at home there. The hidden one rests in his innermost place. The festival procession is 3,000 years gone, but somewhere in the warm air above the Avenue of Rams there is still, perhaps, some faint memory of the drums and the incense and the bright feet of the dancers, moving through the long morning of the world. Let it all grow distant now. Let the great columns soften into shadow. Let the warm stone cool in the evening air. Let the avenue grow quiet and the sacred lake grow still, and the obelisk catch the last of the light at its tip before the darkness comes and covers everything with equal, gentle peace. You have traveled far tonight and seen much, and now there is nothing more to know. Let yourself drift down, softly and slowly, into rest. There is something quietly wonderful about the idea that words can be pictures. That a small, carefully drawn bird, the exact curve of its wing, the tilt of its head can hold a sound inside it, or the name of a thing, or a whole breath of meaning. Before you let yourself drift toward sleep tonight, let us spend a little while in that idea. Let us sit with it gently, the way you might sit beside a slow river and watch the current move without any need to understand exactly where it is going. This is the story of hieroglyphs. Picture the walls of a great Egyptian temple some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in the warm valley of the Nile. The stone is pale and enormous, cut into columns as wide as old trees and as tall as several men standing one upon another. The light outside is brilliant, as it always is in that dry land, but here in the shade of the temple forecourt, the air is cool and still, and it smells faintly of incense and of stone. And on every surface, running in careful columns from the top of the wall nearly to the floor, carved with extraordinary patience into the hard rock, and painted in colors of blue and green and ochre and red are the signs. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, an eye gazing serenely outward, a seated man with his hand raised to his mouth, a folded bolt of cloth, a snake long and curved, a crouching lion, a feather upright and precise, a circle with a single dot at its center, which is the ancient image of the sun, reeds water, feet walking forward, a hand open and a hand closed, owls with enormous round eyes, ibises with their long curved beaks, beetles, jars, loaves of bread, human legs in the act of running. The walls are alive with small, patient images, and every one of them is doing something. Every one of them is part of a language. The Egyptians themselves had a name for this writing. They called it the words of the gods. That was their name for it, not a word meaning carved marks or painted signs, but something sacred, something that had been given to them by the divine. And there is a kind of logic in that. For the Egyptians, language was not merely practical. Words had power. To write a thing was to make it real in some deep sense, to give it permanence, to send it out into time. And what could be more worthy of such permanence than signs that were themselves small, perfect images of the world? A hieroglyph could work in several ways at once, and that is what made the system so rich and so difficult to learn. Some signs stood for the things they pictured. A drawing of a mouth could simply mean mouth, but the same sign could also be used to represent the sound of the word for mouth, which could then be fitted together with other sounds to spell out an entirely different word that happened to share those sounds. And some signs worked as hints or guides, placed beside other signs to indicate what sort of word was being spelled, whether it referred to a person or an animal or a place or an action of the body or something abstract and harder to draw. The system was layered, interwoven, subtle. You could spend years learning to read it and still find something you had not noticed before. And people did spend years learning, for this knowledge was not given to everyone. In the world of ancient Egypt, the ability to read and write hieroglyphs belonged to a distinct and honored class of people known as scribes. They were trained from boyhood, often the sons of scribes themselves, entering the houses of instruction young and spending years in the patient study of the signs. They learned to draw each one correctly, to hold the brush or the reed pen steadily, to work quickly without losing precision. They learned the grammar of the language, the conventions of the writing, the different styles suited to different purposes. They learned in time to read not just the great formal inscriptions on temple walls, but the other scripts too, the faster, more flowing hands that Egyptians used for everyday life. Being a scribe was not a small thing. Scribes held a place of genuine power and respect in Egyptian society. They kept the accounts of the kingdom, the records of grain measured and taxes paid and land boundaries carefully settled. They copied out sacred texts. They wrote letters for those who could not write their own. They served pharaohs and priests and nobles and merchants, and their work touched every part of the life of the land, and the scribes themselves were proud of this. We have texts from ancient Egypt in which the scribe's life is praised against the harder labor of the farmer, the carpenter, the soldier, the man who works with his hands in sun and mud. Better, these texts say with a kind of cheerful satisfaction, to sit in the shade with a palette and a brush. The education of a scribe began with the simplest exercises, copying single signs over and over, feeling the muscles of the hand learn the shape, the wrist learn the right angle of approach. Then came short words, then phrases, then whole texts, many of which were themselves passages from earlier scribal literature, so that even the training was a form of transmission, the knowledge of one generation pressed into the fingers of the next. A student might spend the better part of a decade at this work before he was considered ready to take his place in the offices and temples and courts that needed him. But when he was ready, he occupied a position few could challenge. He had mastered something most people in Egypt would never come close to knowing. The palette itself was a simple and elegant thing. A flat board, often of wood, with two small round wells at one end to hold cakes of black and red ink, and a hollow channel running down its length to hold the brushes or the fine reed pens. The ink was mixed with water. The black came from carbon, from soot or charcoal, and the red from a warm mineral pigment. The scribe would wet the pen, work it against the ink cake to load it, and then write on papyrus. Papyrus was extraordinary, a writing surface made from the pith of a tall aquatic reed that grew in abundance along the edges of the Nile, sliced into thin strips, laid in 2 layers that crossed each other, pressed and dried until they bonded into something smooth and light and durable, a material you could roll up, carry under your arm, send across the country, store in a jar. Sheets of papyrus could be joined end to end to make long scrolls. On papyrus, the scribes of Egypt wrote in a flowing, cursive hand very different from the careful, formal hieroglyphs of the temples. This everyday script, called hieratic, and a later, even faster script called demotic, were the workhorses of the written world, the scripts of letters and accounts, and legal records and medical notes and storytelling and love songs. And there were love songs. That is perhaps one of the most quietly touching things about the writing of ancient Egypt, that it preserved not only the proclamations of kings and the prayers of priests, but the voices of ordinary life. We have letters from sons to mothers and from mothers to sons. We have complaints about missing deliveries and requests to borrow tools. We have hymns of praise to the sun and to the flooding of the river, and stories of gods and heroes, and wisdom texts full of careful advice about how to behave and speak and carry oneself through the days. We have medical recipes and mathematical problems set down with careful working. We have poems in which a young person addresses the one they love with an imagery of gardens and birds and the scent of flowers, poems that carry the same tenderness as poems written in any century since. One of the oldest of the great religious texts, the Book of the Dead, was written out on papyrus to be buried with the deceased, a kind of guide and companion for the journey through the world that came after this one. Spell after spell, drawn in beautiful script, each one intended to help the soul navigate what lay ahead, to pass through gates, to answer questions correctly, to present a heart that would weigh lightly on the scales of judgment. We find copies of this text tucked into coffins and wrapped with mummies, the writing close and careful, the small figures of gods and birds and the symbols of the afterlife arranged in rows, as though the words themselves were a kind of armor or a map. It is an extraordinary thing to hold this knowledge, that in the mind of the ancient Egyptian, the written word could follow you even past the boundary of life and do its work there too. And on the great monuments and the careful formal script that we think of when we picture hieroglyphs, the kings and queens of Egypt left their own voices behind. Their names were placed inside a distinctive shape that we call a cartouche, an oval ring, like a loop of rope drawn around the letters, enclosing and protecting the royal name. The cartouche was thought to offer a kind of divine protection, holding the name safe within its oval embrace. On every obelisk, every temple, every statue base, the cartouche of the reigning pharaoh told the world who had built this place, who had ordered these walls carved, who had dedicated this hall to the gods. The cartouches of Rameses, of Thutmose, of Hatshepsut, of Cleopatra, these loops of stone letters carried those names forward across the centuries, waiting, as it turned out, for someone who could still read them. But that reader was a long time coming. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was never wide to begin with. It had always been the possession of a trained few. And as the centuries passed and the world around Egypt shifted, as the great pharaonic civilization gave way to Persian rule, and then to Greek, and then to Roman, the number of people who held that knowledge grew smaller and smaller. The temples where the old religion was practiced were the last places where the training was kept alive, where young men still learned to carve the old signs in the old ways. But temple by temple, across the long late centuries of the ancient world, the old religion faded. The rituals that had given the writing its purpose, the beliefs that had made it holy, were slowly replaced by others, and with them went the last teachers. The final dated hieroglyphic inscription we know of was carved on the island of Falah, on the southern edge of Egypt, in the year we now call 394. After that, silence. For some 1400 years, through the rise of new religions, through the great shifts of power and culture that remade the ancient world, through all the centuries of the medieval age and the long centuries that followed, not a single living person could read those walls. The signs remained everywhere, patient on the stone. But their meaning was gone. Egypt spoke in thousands of carvings and scrolls and painted walls, and the world heard nothing. People tried, scholars through the centuries looked at hieroglyphs with great curiosity and wrote about what they thought they meant. Most assumed, quite reasonably but wrongly, that each sign must be a symbol standing for a concept, a kind of picture code for ideas rather than a system that also represented sounds. They spun elaborate and often beautiful interpretations, but they were working in the dark. The key was missing. And without the key, all the patient beauty of the carved signs was simply a silence, a face turned away. Travelers from across the Mediterranean and later from Europe came to Egypt and stood before the temples and the obelisks and felt the weight of the mystery. The signs were clearly a form of language, the regularity of them, the repeated patterns, the careful arrangement in rows, all said this was intentional, this was deliberate, this was communication, but no one alive could say what it communicated. When obelisks were carried to Rome in the ancient period, and later when more were moved to the great cities of Europe, they went with their inscriptions intact but their voices gone. They stood in public squares, tall and dark and covered in signs that everyone could see and no one could hear. The The silence of Egypt had become, somehow, part of the grandeur of Egypt, as if a great monument's mystery was part of its meaning. Then in 1799, soldiers in Napoleon Bonaparte's army were digging in the Egyptian town of Rosetta, near the northern coast of the country, in the wide, flat delta where the Nile splits and spreads before reaching the sea. One of the officers noticed a large slab of dark granodiorite, a stone of deep gray-black, lying partly buried in the rubble of an old wall. It was clearly an ancient piece, and it was covered in writing not in one script, but in three. Along the top, the formal hieroglyphs, in the middle a cursive demotic script, and along the bottom, Greek. Greek the scholars who examined it recognized immediately and could read without difficulty. The Greek text proved to be a decree, issued in the year 196 before our era, by a council of Egyptian priests in honor of the young King Ptolemy V, listing the honors the king had granted to the temples, and directing that this decree be set up in every temple in the country. And if the Greek section said this, then presumably the hieroglyphic section said the same thing. Here at last was something that could be compared, a known text and an unknown one, saying the same thing, side by side on the same stone. The Rosetta Stone, as it came to be called, was brought eventually to England, where it entered the collection of the British Museum. And across Europe, the slow and careful effort to decipher it began. It was not a simple task. The stone offered a comparison, but that alone was not enough. The question of how the hieroglyphs actually worked, whether the signs represented sounds or concepts or some combination of both, still had to be answered. Many gifted people worked on the problem. An English scholar of remarkable breadth and talent, Thomas Young, made genuine progress in the early years of the 19th century. He recognized that the cartouches likely contained royal names, and he worked out which signs corresponded to the sounds of the name Ptolemy as it would have been written phonetically. He grasped that at least some of the signs were phonetic, that they stood for sounds rather than ideas. These were real contributions, careful and important, and they opened a door that others would walk through. The man who walked through it furthest, who stood on the other side and found himself suddenly able to read, truly read, what had been silent for more than a millennium, was a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion. Champollion had loved Egypt since he was a child. There is a story, perhaps a little polished in the retelling, that he encountered hieroglyphs as a boy and declared with the confident certainty of the young that he would one day read them. Whether or not the story is exact in every detail, what is true is that he devoted himself to the languages of the ancient world with a passion and a thoroughness that was extraordinary even in a scholarly age. He learned Coptic, the late form of the ancient Egyptian language that had survived in the liturgy of the Christian communities of Egypt, still spoken and written by certain communities into his own time. This mattered enormously because Coptic preserved something of how the ancient language had actually sounded, the vowels, the grammar, the living voice of the tongue that had produced the hieroglyphs. When Champollion applied this knowledge to the problem of the stone, working through the comparative texts with exceptional care, testing each idea against the evidence, the pieces began to fall into place. He understood that the system was not one thing but several things at once, phonetic signs and concept signs and classifying signs all working together, woven through each other in a way that no purely symbolic interpretation could ever account for. He could hear in the Coptic the sounds that some of the ancient signs must have been encoding. And in September of 1822, in Paris, in a moment he later described with words that suggest he could barely contain himself, he suddenly found that he could read, not just guess, not just approximate, read. He ran to find his brother. He was so overwhelmed that he fainted, and when he recovered and could speak clearly again, he had in his hands the key to 1400 years of silence. Champollion went on to publish his findings, to refine them, to argue for them against those who doubted or disputed. He traveled to Egypt itself in the final years of his life, the first scholar who could walk into a temple and read the walls as he walked, silently translating as he moved through the cool columns of stone, the inscriptions flowing around him like a conversation. He died young in 1832, worn down by decades of intense study and the Egyptian journey he had longed for all his life. But the door he had opened did not close behind him. Others followed, and the field of Egyptology was born, and the long conversation with the ancient world resumed. What poured through that open door was extraordinary. The walls of the temples could be read. The papyrus scrolls in museum collections across Europe, gathered for years by curious collectors who admired their beauty without being able to understand them, suddenly had voices. The cartouches gave up their names, not just Ptolemy and Cleopatra, whose names Champollion had used as anchors in his decipherment, but Ramesses and Thutmose and Amenhotep and dozens of others, the long roll call of the pharaohs reaching back into the deep past. The prayers carved into tomb walls were prayers again, not mere decoration. The accounts and the letters became readable correspondence between actual people. The love poems became what they had always been, the voices of individuals speaking to other individuals across the oldest kind of longing. And what those voices said when the long silence finally ended was not so strange. They told of the greatness of the kingdom and the power of the gods, yes. They told of battles won and temples built and offerings made in the flickering light of oil lamps and dim sanctuaries. But they also told of ordinary things. A mother worried about her son far away. A farmer recorded the level of the flood. A scribe, practicing his letters, grew tired and wrote something rueful about the difficulty of the work. A poet compared the eyes of the beloved to the eyes of a gazelle, and found in that comparison something that made them want to write it down, to send it forward into time, to let someone else, somewhere else, feel what they were feeling. That is what the writing preserved in the end, not just the grand and official record of a civilization, but the texture of it, the roughness and warmth of individual lives, thought and felt and set down in ink on pale papyrus, or carved with patient care into the stone of a wall that would outlast everything the writer knew. The Egyptians carved their words into stone because stone endures, and they were right. 4,000 years later, those walls still stand. The signs are still there, still patient, still precise in every detail, the tilt of the bird's head, the exact curve of the snake, the open eye looking outward. They outlasted the civilization that made them. They outlasted the knowledge of how to read them. And then, after 14 centuries of silence, someone learned to listen again. It is a kind of miracle if you let yourself feel it, that a man sitting at a desk in Paris in 1822 could suddenly hear the voice of a temple priest in Thebes from 3,000 years before, that the scratch of a reed pen on papyrus, the patient chip of a stonemason's tool on a wall of pale stone, could carry meaning across that vast distance and deposit it, still intact, still clear, into a living mind. Let us rest in that idea for a moment. The signs are still there on the walls tonight, in the cool dark of the temples, in the still air of the museum cases where the scrolls are kept, in the photographs and copies and careful scholarly editions in libraries all around the world. They are patient. They have always been patient. They know how to wait. And somewhere in that patience is a kind of comfort. The words were lost and they were found. The silence lasted a long time, but it ended. And when it ended, what came through it was the sound of people who built great things and worried about ordinary things, who loved each other and argued with each other and watched the flooding of the river and the setting of the sun, and who felt, somewhere underneath all of it, that some things were worth writing down, worth carving in stone, worth sending forward into the unknown future for whoever might one day read them. Here in the warmth of the valley of the Nile, the hieroglyphs wait on their walls. The small birds and the watching eyes and the reeds and the water signs, row after quiet row, glowing softly where the light falls through the doorways of the temples. The stone is cool to the touch. The air smells of dust and of time. And the words of the gods, as the Egyptians called them, go on saying what they have always said, patient, precise, and full of everything a civilization thought was worth preserving. Let all of that grow soft now and distant. Let the carved walls dissolve gently into the dark behind your eyes and the sound of the temple fall away into quiet. The signs will still be there when morning comes, as they have always been. For now, let them rest. Let yourself rest with them in the long, patient stillness of the stone. Drift now softly into sleep. Tonight, let us drift together toward one of the oldest and most beautiful ideas the human mind has ever imagined. There is nothing you need to hold on to, nothing that needs deciding. You can let the words come softly, the way a warm current moves beneath still water, and let yourself go quiet and let yourself sink. This is the story of what the ancient Egyptians believed waited beyond the edge of life. And it begins, as so many things in Egypt begin, beside the river. Picture the Nile in the time before clocks, before maps, before much of the world that we know had taken any shape at all. Along its banks in the dry and golden land, a civilization had grown up over thousands of years, patient and intricate and deeply rooted, like one of the great fig trees that lean out over the water in the slow afternoon light. The Egyptians built their world from the river's rhythm, from the rise and fall of the flood that came each year to darken the soil and feed the harvest, and they watched that rhythm long enough and deeply enough to find in it something like a promise. Things that seemed to end, they noticed, did not always end. The sun went down each evening and came back in the morning. The flood withdrew and the green shoots returned. Even the stars that vanished below the horizon found their way back to the sky. From this, they drew a quiet and hopeful conclusion. Death, perhaps, was not an ending, it was a passage. A journey undertaken, a transformation prepared for, and if one was careful and good and ready, something that opened into a continuation of life in a perfected and permanent form. This was not a fearful thing to them in the way we might expect, or at least it was not meant to be. The Egyptians did not spend their days trembling at the thought of what lay ahead. Rather, they prepared for it with care and with love, the same way a careful traveler might spend weeks readying a long voyage, gathering provisions, choosing what to carry, making sure nothing important was left behind. Death was a threshold, and the business of life was, in part, to arrive at that threshold well prepared. To understand what they believed lay on the other side, it helps first to understand how the Egyptians thought of the self. We tend to think of a person as one thing, a single being contained in a single body. The Egyptians saw it differently. They understood the self as something plural, something layered, with different aspects that served different purposes and at death went different ways. Two of these aspects mattered most for the journey that was to come. The first was called the Ka. The Ka was something like the life force, the animating energy that distinguished a living person from an empty vessel. It was not quite the same as what we might call the soul, but it was close. The Ka was what made you in the deep and continuing sense. It lived on after the body stopped breathing, and it needed, in its continued existence, to be nourished. This is why the tombs of Egypt were stocked with food and drink, why the relatives of the dead brought offerings to the tomb entrance, why the temple priests performed their rituals of provision. The Ka still needed to eat in its way. It still needed to receive what it had always received, the care and attention of those who loved it. The second was called the Ba. The Ba was closer to what we might call personality, or perhaps the individual spirit, the part of you that was distinctly and irreducibly yourself, the part that held your particular way of laughing, your loves, your memories, your manner. The Egyptians often pictured the Ba as a bird, a human-headed bird that could fly freely in and out of the tomb, moving between the world of the living and the world of the dead as it needed to. The Ba could return to the body during the night. It could go out into the warm sunlight during the day. It was not trapped. It was free, in a way, moving between two worlds that, for the Egyptians, were never entirely separate. For both of these to endure, to continue their existence across the long ages, one thing was essential. The body itself had to be preserved. This is where we come to the practice that the Egyptians developed with such extraordinary care over so many centuries, the practice we call mummification. And I want to ask you to hold it gently in your mind as you hear about it, because the Egyptians held it gently too. This was not a grim procedure to them. It was an act of devotion. It was a labor of love undertaken over the course of about 70 days, carried out by specialists who knew their work as a kind of sacred craft, who said prayers as they worked, who understood themselves to be serving the dead person, tending to them, preparing them for the journey ahead. The body was washed with great care and brought to the place of preparation. The organs within, which would otherwise decay quickly, were removed and kept safe in their own containers, sealed jars watched over by protective spirits. These jars were made with care and placed in the tomb alongside the body, so that everything belonging to the person remained close, remained together. One organ, however, was never removed. The heart was left in place, exactly where it was, because the Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of the mind, the home of thought and memory and conscience. The heart was the most important thing the person carried, and it would be needed for what came next. The body was then packed in and covered with a natural salt called natron, which had the quiet property of drawing away moisture, of drying the body slowly and thoroughly until it was preserved against the long centuries. This took many weeks, and when the drying was done, the body was anointed with oils and resins, then wrapped round and round in fine linen, layer upon careful layer, with small protective charms and amulets tucked between the bindings at each stage. Little carved figures of gods and sacred symbols, whose purpose was to guard and guide and bless the traveler on the road ahead. When all of this was done, the wrapped and tended body was placed in its coffin, which was itself a work of beauty and of meaning, painted with images and texts and prayers, a kind of house for the preserved person, a portable shelter to carry them safely into the next world. The tomb itself was made ready with equal care. Think of the tomb not as a grave in the way we usually picture one, a dark and empty place of ending, but as a home prepared for a very long journey. The Egyptians understood it that way. They stocked it the way you might stock a house for a beloved traveler who would be gone a very long time. There was food and drink, of course, loaves of bread and jars of beer and wine and oil, so that the ka would be nourished. There was furniture, beds and chairs and chests for clothing. There were favorite objects from the person's life, things they had loved, things they had used, things that would make the next world feel familiar and welcoming. And there were the shabtis. The shabtis were small figures, often shaped from faience or stone or wood, made like tiny mummified people with their arms crossed, often holding little tools. They were workers, servants, helpers for the journey ahead. For the Egyptians believed that even in the next world there would be labor required of the soul, fields to tend, canals to dig, work to be done. The shabtis would answer when called upon. If the soul was asked to perform any task in the next world, the shabti would step forward and say, "Here I am, I will do it." A well-prepared tomb might hold dozens of them, one for each day of the year, and a few overseers besides, small carved figures of quiet and absolute fidelity, waiting in the dark to serve. On the walls of the tomb, in paint and in carved relief, were images of life at its finest. Gardens in full harvest, families feasting together, musicians playing, birds rising from the papyrus marshes at the edge of the Nile. These were not merely decorations. They were statements of intention, pictures of what the next world was meant to be, images of the good life carried forward into permanence. And there were words. From early in Egyptian history and over the many centuries that followed, the Egyptians gathered collections of spells, prayers, and guiding passages meant to help the dead person navigate the journey that lay ahead. What we now call the Book of the Dead is not really one book. It was never one fixed text. It was a collection, a treasury of protective words and useful knowledge, copied out by skilled scribes onto papyrus scrolls and placed in the tomb of the person, or inscribed upon the walls of the tomb itself. Different versions for different times, different families choosing different passages, but all of them serving the same purpose, to give the traveler the knowledge they would need, the words that would open locked doors, the names of the gates and the guardians they would encounter along the way, the prayers that would smooth the road ahead. Because the road ahead was not simple. The journey through the next world, the hidden realm the Egyptians called the Juet, was a journey through the night. The sun itself made this journey every night, passing through the dark realm beneath the earth and emerging again in the morning, reborn and blazing into the eastern sky. The soul of the dead person traveled a similar path, moving through the long darkness toward a great and consequential moment. The Egyptians pictured this realm as a landscape with its own geography, its own rivers and gates and regions, its own creatures and guardians. There were serpents to be named and calmed, threshold keepers who demanded the correct response before they would step aside. The protective spells copied out on the long papyrus scrolls were maps and passwords for this landscape, knowledge that could mean the difference between finding the way through and losing it in the dark. But the traveler was not alone. There were gods who helped, who guided, who had walked this path before. And the words carried with them were a kind of company in themselves, the voices of the living reaching after the dead, saying, "We are with you, we have prepared for this, we have given you what you need." Think for a moment about what it meant to carry those words with you. In life, a scribe in ancient Egypt was among the most respected of all people because words had power, written words especially. To name a thing was to make it real. To speak the correct words at the correct moment was to command the attention of the world, seen and unseen. And so the spells and prayers tucked into the tomb with the dead were not mere wishes. They were tools. They were the keys that opened specific doors. The person who entered the hidden world was not wandering helplessly in the dark. They were a traveler with a map, a prepared traveler with provisions, with helpers, with the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had spent thousands of years thinking carefully about this exact journey. The Egyptians took the afterlife as seriously as they took the harvest, as seriously as they took the rising of the flood, as something that required planning and attention and the proper observance of the right things in the right order. And that seriousness was itself a form of tenderness. It was a way of saying that the dead deserved the same care and preparation as any other important undertaking in life. And at the end of that long passage, the soul arrived at the place of judgment. This is one of the most luminous images in all of ancient Egyptian belief, and I want you to hold it gently as you let yourself drift. Picture a great hall, vast and still, lit by a light that has no particular source, warm and even like the light of a calm and perfect afternoon. This hall is called the Hall of Two Truths, and in it, the entire weight of a person's life is brought to a single still moment. At the center of the hall stands a balance, a great scale with two pans. In one pan, light as a breath, is placed a single feather. It is the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and right order, the feather of the great principle that the Egyptians believed held the whole world in its proper shape. Ma'at was not just a goddess. She was the idea of harmony, of justice, of the way things ought to be when everything is as it should be. Her feather was the lightest thing imaginable, and also the most important. In the other pan of the scale is placed the heart. And the heart must be as light as the feather. If a person had lived well and truly, if their heart was clear and honest and had not been weighed down by cruelty or dishonesty or the harm done to others, then the scales would balance. The heart would rest level with the feather of truth, and the way would be open. Standing nearby, watching the scale with careful attention, is the jackal-headed god Anubis. He is the guardian of the dead, the one who guides souls through the dark passage, the one who presides over this great moment with steady and unhurried attention. He holds the scale or stands beside it, his dark eyes grave and kind. He is not a frightening figure, despite his animal head and his ancient association with the dead. He is a protector. He is the god who accompanied the soul through the darkness, who ensured the long, careful preparation of the body was done with the proper reverence, who now stands beside the traveler at the most important moment of their entire existence. Nearby, with stylus and scroll, stands the ibis-headed god Thoth, the keeper of knowledge and writing, the recorder of all things. What the scale reveals, Thoth will write down faithfully, without error and without favor. His record is the truth of the matter. And watching from his throne, presiding over the whole proceeding with a calm and ancient authority, is Osiris, the lord of the next world. The green-faced king of the dead, seated in majesty, wrapped as a mummy, holding the crook and the flail. He has been where the soul now stands. He was the first to die and the first to be brought back. His story is woven into the heart of what the Egyptians believed, and it is worth pausing here in that soft and luminous hall to let it come forward. Osiris was once a king, a good and wise king who ruled the land and was beloved by the people. His brother Set, who was jealous and hungry for what Osiris had, killed him and scattered his body across the earth. But Osiris had a wife, the goddess Isis, who loved him with a love that did not accept the finality of death. She went out across the land and gathered him piece by patient piece with her sister Nephthys beside her, and with the help of Anubis she tended to him and bound him and restored him. Osiris was brought back, transformed. He could not return to the world of the living, but he became lord of another world, the perfected world beyond, and in becoming that lord he became the promise, the living proof, that death was not the end of things. The Egyptians found in this story everything they needed. Because Osiris had been restored, every person who died could, in a certain sense, become Osiris. Every mummy was Osiris. Every soul making the long journey through the dark world was following in the path that Osiris had first walked, traveling toward the same transformation, the same renewal. To die well was to become, in some measure, like the great Green King himself. The love at the center of that story also matters. It was not a god who conquered death through power or through some heroic act of battle. It was love that restored Osiris. Patient love, grieving love, love that went out searching piece by piece across the whole earth and did not stop. Isis, who would not accept losing him. That is the love that opened the door, and the Egyptians kept that truth close. The next world was not a cold reward handed down by some distant and indifferent authority. It was a place reached through love, maintained by love, made possible because someone had cared enough to gather what was scattered and hold it together. And so, in the Hall of Two Truths, if the heart was true and the scales balanced, the soul passed through the final gate and entered what lay beyond. The Field of Reeds. This is the name the Egyptians gave to the paradise that waited, and the name itself tells you something about what it was. Not a place of abstract bliss, not a featureless eternity, but a place that looked like home, like Egypt, but perfected. The river flowed there, clear and calm and faithful. The fields were green and yielding, the harvest always abundant, the flood always gentle and just right. The light was the warm, familiar light of a good day in the world you had always loved. There were gardens and pools and shade in the long afternoon and the company of those who had gone before. Everything that had been good in life continued there, only better, only more lasting, freed at last from the drought and the flood and the grinding ordinary difficulties of existence. It was the best version of the world you already loved, extending outward forever into a permanent and sunlit afternoon. A person could work their fields in the field of reeds, and the Shabtis would come forward gladly to help with any labor. A person could sit by the water in the long golden afternoon with those they had missed. The things that had been lost might at last be restored, and all of it would endure. There is something deeply moving about this vision when you sit quietly with it for a moment. The Egyptians were surrounded by the evidence of time's power over all things. They watched the river carve the stone. They watched the desert take back what had been built. They knew, as all people know in the end, that nothing made of flesh and wood and mud could last forever. And yet they reached for permanence anyway with both hands, with all the ingenuity and labor and love they had. The pyramids were built against forgetting. The tombs were packed with the evidence of life. The bodies were preserved against the decay that they knew was always coming. This was not denial, it was desire. A very human and very beautiful desire for the things they loved to continue. All of it, when you look at it closely, was an act of love. The family that brought offerings to the tomb each season, the priests who recited the words of provision, the skilled craftsmen who wrapped the body with such care, who tucked each small amulet between each layer of linen, the artists who painted the walls of the tomb with sunlit gardens and smiling figures and birds rising from the green marsh, the scribes who copied out the protective words on the long scroll, drawing each hieroglyph with a fine brush and a steady hand. All of them were saying the same thing in different ways. We love this person. We are not willing to simply let them go. We will do everything in our power to carry them through, to provision them, to protect them, to bring them safely to the place where they can rest in abundance. And perhaps, too, all of it was an act of faith in life itself. The Egyptians did not hate the world they lived in. They adored it. The Nile and the papyrus marshes and the ibis standing still in the shallows and the warm flat light on the desert stone and the smell of bread baking and the sound of a river city waking in the early morning. They found their world beautiful, and the thought of leaving it entirely, the lovely particular things of this life simply ceasing, was one they could not fully accept. So they built a place next door to it, a luminous echo of it, where the good things went on. We are all in our own ways doing something like this. We hold on to what we love. We build things to outlast us. We tell the stories again and again, passing them from one quiet mind to another across the long dark of the years. And in that telling, something continues. The hall is still open. The scale is still balanced. The feather still rests light and true on its side of the pan. Let us leave the great hall now, quietly, and walk out through one of its passages into the cool starry air of the Egyptian night. The river is there in the darkness, moving with its old unhurried patience toward the sea. Somewhere upstream the city sleeps. Somewhere in the hills the carved tombs hold their quiet treasure, their painted gardens, their rows of faithful Shabtis, their long-tended and carefully beloved dead. The stars that the Egyptians watched for thousands of years still turn above the desert tonight, the same ones they navigated by, the same ones they used to orient the great buildings with such precision. The same stars that look down on the weighing of the heart look down on us now. And somewhere, if we let ourselves rest into the warmth of the thought, the field of reeds extends in its sunlit permanence, and the river there flows on, and the harvest ripens in its season, and the afternoon is long and golden and still, and everyone who was loved is there, and everything is all right, and the light does not fail. Rest now, let the hall and the feather and the careful scroll of Thoth drift slowly away into the warm dark. Let the river carry you. There is nothing more to prepare for tonight, nothing more to carry. You have already arrived somewhere good and quiet. Let yourself sink into it gently, the way the sun sinks below the western hills, knowing as the Egyptians knew that what goes down into the dark has every beautiful reason to rise again in the morning. Drift now, let sleep find you. Tonight, let us travel together to a place where the sea meets the ancient world, to a city built on a narrow tongue of land between the blue Mediterranean and the still waters of a great lake, gleaming white under an Egyptian sun. There is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. You can let these words come softly, the way light settles on old water, and let yourself drift slowly down towards sleep. This is the story of Cleopatra and of the last age of the pharaohs. Picture, if you will, the city of Alexandria at the western edge of the Great Nile Delta, in the years not long before the turning of the era we call our own. It is a city like no other in the ancient world. Its streets are laid out in a great grid, broad and airy, intersecting at right angles in the manner of cities planned all at once rather than grown slowly over generations. The harbors face north, open to the sea, and on a small island just offshore, connected to the city by a long man-made causeway, there rises a tower of such extraordinary height that sailors far out at sea can see it even before they see the land itself. At night, a fire burns from its summit, and the light sweeps across the dark water to guide ships safely home. This is the Pharaohs of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, patient and brilliant in the dark. And the city it guards is worthy of such a guardian. Alexandria is vast and prosperous and full of people from every corner of the known world. There are Egyptians and Greeks and Jews, merchants from Arabia and Syria and the far shores of the Black Sea, scholars and sailors and soldiers and scribes. The streets carry the smell of spice and salt and baked bread and the blue drift of incense from 100 temples. In the markets, a dozen languages rise and fall together. And at the heart of the city, behind its colonnades and gardens, stands the institution that more than any other gives Alexandria its peculiar, shining dignity. This is the library. Not simply a library, but the Great Library of Alexandria, a project of breathtaking ambition. It was built to hold all the knowledge of the world. Its founders sent agents out to every city, every port, every marketplace, with orders to buy or borrow or copy every scroll they could find. Ships arriving in the harbor were searched, and any books found aboard were taken and copied before being returned. In this way, over many generations, the library came to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works of philosophy and medicine, of mathematics and poetry, of history and drama and astronomy, gathered from every civilization that had ever written anything down. Near the library stood the Mauseon, a kind of ancient university, where scholars from across the known world came to read and study and argue and think. Here in the bright rooms of this place, men worked out the circumference of the earth and the motions of the planets, mapped the stars and proved the theorems that students still study today, wrote the commentaries and grammars that would preserve the great works of Greek literature down through the centuries. It was one of the most remarkable concentrations of human learning that the ancient world ever produced, and it bloomed here, in this city beside the sea, in the Egypt of the last pharaohs. For Egypt by this time had long passed into the hands of a remarkable family of Greek kings. Let us go back a little to understand how this came to be. Several centuries before Cleopatra, there had come to Egypt a conqueror from the north, a young Macedonian king whose name was Alexander, and who moved through the ancient world like a force of nature. He had already humbled the Persian Empire and marched his armies across countries that no Greek soldier had ever seen, when he turned his attention to Egypt, and Egypt welcomed him as a liberator from the Persians who had ruled there before. Alexander visited the old sacred places, walked the desert to the oracle at the oasis of Siwa, and was declared a son of the god. And in the northwest of the Nile Delta, on a site he chose himself, he laid out the plan for a new city and named it after himself. Then he rode on, east and north and east again, into the vast unknown. Alexander never returned to Egypt. He died young in the city of Babylon, having crossed a world that most men of his age could not have imagined. He left behind an empire and no clear heir. His generals, who had followed him through all those campaigns and grown old in his service, divided the world between them. And Egypt fell to one of the wisest of those men, a Macedonian general named Ptolemy, who took the country and began to build something new. Ptolemy was careful and clever. He understood that to rule Egypt he must not merely command it, but inhabit it, must wear its history like a garment. He and his successors took on the old titles of the pharaohs. They built new temples in the ancient Egyptian style, with their names carved in the hieroglyphic script on the sacred walls. They honored the Egyptian gods alongside their own, presenting themselves not as conquerors, but as the latest in an unbroken line of kings going back to the very beginning of time. And they built Alexandria into the most splendid city in the Mediterranean world, a city that was Greek in its learning and its language, but Egyptian in its bones, sitting at the junction of two great civilizations, fed by the ancient wealth of the Nile. This family, the Ptolemies, reigned for nearly 3 centuries. Brilliant and troubled and sometimes turbulent among themselves, they were a family who disposed of rivals with a thoroughness that was unsentimental even by the standards of ancient royal courts. The throne passed from father to son, and sometimes in directions determined by blood and politics and force. But through all of it, Egypt endured. The Nile flooded and receded as it had always done. The farmers planted and harvested. The temples stood and the priests performed their rituals, and the great old civilization of Egypt went quietly about its ancient business, absorbing its Greek rulers as it had absorbed so many conquerors before. And then in the year that we count as 69 before our era, into this long-lived and complicated royal family, a daughter was born. She would be called Cleopatra, the 7th of that name in her family. We do not know precisely what she looked like. The coins and carvings that survive show a woman with a strong profile and a sharp, purposeful gaze, but whether these are flattering or accurate, no one can now say. What the ancient writers agree upon, and what seems beyond question, is that she was a woman of unusual intelligence and force of personality, trained in the traditions of her family and the learning of her city, and who took both very seriously. Her family had ruled Egypt for 250 years, and in all that time, for all their care to appear as Egyptian kings, not one of them had ever troubled to learn the Egyptian language. They ruled in Greek, spoke Greek at court, wrote their letters in Greek. The millions of Egyptians they governed were, in the most practical sense, ruled by strangers who could not speak to them in their own tongue. Cleopatra changed this. She learned Egyptian, and not only Egyptian, but the languages of the neighboring peoples too, the tongue of the Ethiopians and of the Parthians, of the Jews and the Arabs, of the Medes and many others. She was said to be the first member of her dynasty to speak with the Egyptian priests in their own language, and that fact alone set her apart from every Ptolemy who had come before her. She had read widely, studied philosophy and rhetoric, and understood the arts of persuasion not merely as pleasures of the mind, but as instruments of power. She would need every one of those instruments, for she had inherited a throne that was sinking. Egypt was still rich, still formidable, still the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world, but the world itself had changed enormously during the 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. In the West, a new power had risen that made even the memory of Alexander seem modest. Rome had begun as a city on the banks of a river in central Italy, had absorbed first its neighbors and then the whole peninsula, and had then looked outward and kept looking. By the time of Cleopatra's birth, Rome had consumed Carthage and Greece and Spain and most of the Middle East, and the Great Sea itself had become, in practice, a Roman lake. The Ptolemaic kingdom, for all its ancient grandeur, was surrounded. The Romans knew the value of Egypt. They needed its grain to feed their city, its wealth to fund their ambitions, and they were watching, patiently waiting for the right moment. The Ptolemies had survived so long partly by making themselves useful to Rome, sending money and support and being careful never to give the Romans a pretext for open intervention. But the arrangement was fragile, and it rested on the Ptolemies remaining useful without becoming a threat. Into this precarious balance, Cleopatra came to power. She was around 18 when she and her younger brother, nominally her co-ruler as was the custom of her family, ascended to the throne. The brother's advisors soon moved against her, and she was driven from Alexandria, forced to gather what support she could from beyond the borders of Egypt. And then from the west came Julius Caesar. Caesar was already one of the most powerful men in Rome. He had conquered the vast forested lands to the north of Italy and fought a bitter civil war against his rivals for control of the Roman state. He came to Alexandria in the autumn of the year 48 before our era in pursuit of a defeated enemy, and arrived to find that his enemy was already dead. He settled himself in the royal palace and sent word that he wished to see the queen. How exactly Cleopatra made her entrance into Caesar's presence is one of the most famous moments in this whole long story, though the details are uncertain. The version that has come down most vividly through the centuries has her smuggled past her enemies and into the palace rolled inside a bundle of bedclothes or perhaps a carpet, unwrapped to reveal herself to the Roman general in a gesture of audacity and theater that must have delighted him. Whether it happened precisely that way, no one can now say with certainty. But the meeting itself is beyond dispute, and so is what followed. Cleopatra and Caesar became allies, and more than allies. Their connection was political and personal at once, two exceptionally capable people recognizing something of themselves in each other. Caesar helped Cleopatra regain her throne, fighting a brief and difficult war in the streets of Alexandria in the winter that followed. What is certain is that by the time the fighting was done, Cleopatra was queen again, and she and Caesar sailed slowly up the Nile together in a great royal barge, moving through the ancient heart of Egypt while the people watched from the banks. She had a son by him whom she called Caesarion, Little Caesar. And then Caesar returned to Rome, back to the great tangled politics of his world, and 2 years later he was assassinated in the Senate chamber by men who feared what he was becoming. For a time, things were uncertain. The world that had organized itself around Caesar had to reorganize itself around his death, and there were several years of war and maneuvering before a new order emerged. And the new order had at its center, on the side that had won, a man named Mark Antony. Antony was everything Caesar had been in some ways and different in others. He was brave and charismatic, a natural soldier who inspired fierce loyalty in the men who served under him. He was also warm and given to the pleasures of life in a way that Caesar, for all his appetites, had disciplined in himself. Antony was sent east to manage Rome's affairs in the eastern Mediterranean, and it was there that his path crossed Cleopatra's again. She received his summons to meet him with a confidence that spoke of everything she had already survived. When she came to him, she arrived not as a supplicant but as an equal, sailing up the river to where he waited in a barge said to be gilded and canopied with silk, its oars silver, its sails perfumed, attended by figures dressed as the old gods of Egypt. Whether or not the description in the ancient sources is precisely accurate, the intention was clear. She was not coming to be inspected. She was presenting herself as the living incarnation of a divine tradition 3,000 years old. Antony, the sources tell us, was entirely captivated. The two became partners in the deepest sense. Their alliance was personal and political and military, a joining of Cleopatra's ancient kingdom and its immense wealth with Antony's Roman legions and his position at the center of the Roman world. They spent long seasons together in Alexandria. They had children together. Antony made various gifts of territory to Cleopatra and her children that infuriated many in Rome, which was accustomed to thinking of the eastern lands as Roman property, not Ptolemaic. He began to seem to his enemies in Rome less like a Roman general and more like an Eastern king, drawn in by the luxury of an ancient court, forgetting his Roman nature. His enemies had a name, and that name was Octavian. Octavian was Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, a young man of extraordinary patience and political intelligence. He was not a great soldier in the personal, charismatic way of Antony, but he was far more calculating, far more careful, and far more systematic in the long game of power. He understood that in Rome, reputation was everything, and he worked methodically to paint Antony as a man who had given himself over to a foreign queen, who had become un-Roman, who had abandoned his duties and his dignity for the perfumed courts of Alexandria. It was an effective campaign, as such campaigns often are, and over the years it eroded Antony's support in Rome while strengthening Octavian's own. The final confrontation came in the late summer of the year 31 before our era, on the western coast of Greece, in the waters off a headland called Actium. It was a great naval battle, and what happened there has been discussed and debated ever since. The fleets of Antony and Cleopatra faced the fleet of Octavian across the blue water of a gulf on a September morning. For some time the issue was uncertain, and then Cleopatra's ships, which had been held in reserve, turned and sailed away to the south, back toward Egypt. Antony, seeing this, followed her. His remaining fleet, abandoned by its commander, fought on for a time and then surrendered. What moved Cleopatra to withdraw and why Antony followed has never been fully explained. Some ancient writers said she panicked, others that there was a strategy behind the retreat that simply failed, others that the battle was already decided against them. Whatever the truth of it, the result was beyond argument. The sea battle of Actium was decided. Octavian had won, and Antony and Cleopatra sailed back to Alexandria with everything changed. They had a little time left, but it was running out. Octavian moved his forces toward Egypt through the autumn and into the following year. Antony rallied what he could, but his support was dissolving as his position collapsed. Cleopatra in those last months worked with the clarity and determination of a woman who understood precisely what was coming. She gathered treasure, sent envoys, explored every avenue that remained. She built a great mausoleum for herself beside the sea. She seems to have understood, with the clear sight of an exceptional mind, that there was probably no way out. Antony died in the summer of 30 before our era by his own hand on the basis of a false report that Cleopatra was already dead. When he learned the truth, he was already beyond saving. He was brought to where she had barricaded herself in her mausoleum, and he died there beside her. And then Cleopatra had to face Octavian alone. She met him, they spoke. What passed between them has been imagined and reimagined ever since, but the outlines are clear enough. Octavian was not unkind to her in his manner, but she understood as he understood that she was a captive, and that her place in his plans was to be led in procession through the streets of Rome as living proof of his victory, the last trophy of the last Eastern War. She had seen what that fate meant for the defeated. She was not a woman who would submit to it. How she died is the most famous question surrounding her life, and the most famous answer is the one that may or may not be true. The story told in ancient sources and cherished ever since is that she arranged for a small serpent to be brought to her, concealed in a basket of figs, and that she allowed it to bite her, and that she died quietly in her rooms in the palace, dressed in her royal robes, lying on a golden couch. The serpent was an asp, a small Egyptian cobra, and in the traditions of Egypt it was a royal creature, an image of divine protection, the very symbol worn on the crowns of the pharaohs. To die by its bite was, in that ancient understanding, to be taken by the god, not executed by a conqueror. It is a beautiful story, and it may be exactly what happened. It may also be a story that gathered itself around a death that was simpler and less theatrical. Some ancient writers were skeptical even then, and the truth of her final hours is something history has kept to itself. Octavian, who found her already dead when his men came to prevent exactly this, had her buried with Antony as she had wished. Whether he genuinely lamented her, or whether her death resolved a difficulty he did not know how to resolve himself, is something only he knew. She was 39 years old. With her death, Egypt passed into the hands of Rome. Octavian, who would soon take the name Augustus and become the first Roman emperor, declared Egypt his personal possession, a province unlike any other, too rich and too important to be entrusted to the ordinary machinery of Roman governance. The great wealth of the Nile Valley would flow to Rome and sustain the empire for centuries to come. And the line of the pharaohs, that extraordinary continuous thread running back through the Ptolemies and through all the native dynasties before them, back 30 centuries to the very first kings who had unified the two lands of the Nile Valley and placed the double crown upon their heads, came at last to its end. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, the last potential heir, was found and quietly put to death. The children she had with Antony were taken to Rome and raised there. The dynasty was finished. Egypt did not vanish. The temples still stood, the priests still performed their rituals, the farmers still planted and harvested along the banks of the Nile. The old gods, Isis and Osiris, Horus and Amun and all the rest, continued to be worshipped, and some of them traveled on the ships of the Mediterranean and found new devotees in cities far from the Nile. The last hieroglyphic inscription we know of was carved on the walls of a temple on a small island in the Nile, nearly 4 centuries after Cleopatra's death, proof that the ancient traditions lingered long in the quiet places. But the world was changing around those temples. New ideas followed the trade routes of the vast Roman network, and in time a new faith spread from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean and transformed the world that had known the pharaohs. One by one, the old sanctuaries fell silent. The priests who knew the ancient script died, and no one learned their knowledge. The meaning of the carvings on the old walls faded from memory. The great library, already diminished, declined across the long centuries, its scrolls scattered or lost. The pharaoh stood for more than 1,000 years before the sea, and the earthquakes finally brought it down, and the sands blew slowly over the old places. What remains is extraordinary. The pyramids still stand in the desert west of the river, so old that even in Cleopatra's time they were ancient monuments, already 14 centuries old when she was born, already the subject of wonder and reverent curiosity. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor and on the banks of the Upper Nile still stand, their walls bright with the paintings of people and gods who moved through a world almost beyond our imagining. The mummies of the pharaohs, wrapped in their ancient ceremonies, have come back into the light in our own century and rest now in museums where anyone may stand and look at them and feel, across the enormous distance of time, something that is almost like recognition. Cleopatra herself left no such relic. Her tomb, which she built with such care beside the sea, has never been found. It lies somewhere under the waters of Alexandria, or under the modern city that has grown on and around and through the ancient one, lost as thoroughly as the library in the pharaohs and the lamplight on the polished floors of the court where she and Caesar and Antony dined together and talked through the long Egyptian evenings. And yet she is not lost. She is perhaps the most remembered woman of the ancient world, and the image of her has multiplied across 20 centuries of painters and playwrights and poets and storytellers, until the real woman at the center of all that brilliance is both hidden and preserved. She has become a kind of symbol, of intelligence meeting force, of an ancient civilization meeting its end with its dignity intact, of a human being who was never less than fully herself, even at the very close. The harbor of Alexandria is quieter now. The sea comes in as it always has, and the sun moves across the water the same way it did on the morning she died. Somewhere beneath those quiet waters lie the foundations of the royal palace where she was born, and the mausoleum she built for herself, and the streets where she walked as a child and began to understand the weight of what she had inherited and what she would have to do. The ships that enter the harbor now navigate by instruments she could not have imagined, but the passage is the same passage it has always been, between the open sea and the shelter of the shore. And so the last age of the pharaohs ended not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow and dignified setting, the way the sun sets in the Egyptian desert, taking its time, painting everything in gold and amber before it goes down, leaving the land dark and warm and full of the traces of the day. 3,000 years of civilization does not vanish. It sinks slowly into the ground, into the language of the people who came after, into the stones that still stand, into the images that still haunt us when we look at the old walls and feel, without quite knowing why, that something very large and very serious and very human passed through this world before us. Let the harbor of Alexandria grow dim now and distant. Let the torches in the great corridor of the library burn slowly down. Let the water lap at the old stone pilings in the darkness, gentle and slow, and let the warmth of that Egyptian night settle over everything, soft and ancient and still. Somewhere out in the dark, the sea that was once the edge of her world goes on moving, the same deep motion it has always made, indifferent and serene. The old city rests beneath it. The pharaohs lie in their painted rooms, in their golden desert, held in the long, patient dark. And you can rest now too. Let the old world grow soft and far away. Let the night come in as it has come in over the Nile for 10,000 years, warm and unhurried, carrying nothing you need to fear. And let yourself drift slowly and gently into sleep. There is a place at the far southern edge of Egypt where the river grows wide and slow, and the land on either bank turns a deep, warm amber in the late afternoon light. The cliffs come down close to the water here, massive and golden and still, and the sky above them is a shade of blue that seems almost too quiet to be real. Sit with that image for a moment. Let the warmth of it settle over you. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do. Simply let yourself drift, gently, toward the long and patient world of the ancient past. This is the story of Abu Simbel. To understand Abu Simbel, you must first understand how far south it lies. Most of what we call ancient Egypt, the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples of Luxor and Karnak, sits in the north, along the broad lower stretches of the Nile where the river fans out into a fertile delta before meeting the sea. But Abu Simbel lies deep in the south, far beyond the first and second cataracts of the river, in a region the ancient Egyptians called Nubia. Here the Nile does not spread and meander. It cuts through red sandstone and golden desert, and the light is harder and the silence deeper, and the feeling is one of great distance from the ordinary world. The ancients called this land Wawat and later Kush, and they held it in a complicated kind of regard, part caution, part reverence, part hunger for its gold and its ebony and its trade. For Egypt and Nubia were bound together for thousands of years, neighbors sharing a river, sometimes at war and sometimes in an uneasy peace, and sometimes so intertwined that it becomes difficult to say where one ended and the other began. It was into this distant and powerful landscape that the pharaoh Rameses II chose to carve his most astonishing monuments. Rameses II ruled Egypt for an extraordinarily long time, more than 60 years, in the period we call the New Kingdom, roughly 3,200 years ago. He is sometimes called Rameses the Great, and the name fits not because he was a saint or even, by modern measure, a particularly just ruler, but because the sheer scale of his ambition and his energy was something close to staggering. He built and rebuilt and expanded temples from the delta in the north to the distant reaches of Nubia in the south. He placed his own image on walls and columns and obelisks and statues in such numbers that scholars who study his reign sometimes joke that Egypt itself became, under his hand, a kind of royal portrait gallery stretching the length of a continent. But Ramesses needed no borrowed glory. He built enough to fill the land twice over. And yet, among all his monuments, the two temples at Abu Simbel stand apart. Perhaps because of where they are, so far from the centers of power, pressed against a cliff above a great river at the very edge of the known world. Perhaps because of their sheer scale, or because of the quiet miracle that takes place within them twice each year. Perhaps simply because time and the slow desert have given them a gravity and a loneliness that no monument nearer to a city can quite achieve. The greater of the two temples was carved directly into the face of a sandstone cliff above the river. Not built stone by stone as most temples were, but excavated, hollowed out, the workers going deeper and deeper into the living rock to create chambers and corridors and inner halls, the way one might hollow a space inside a mountain. And at the entrance, guarding the great opening in the cliff face, 4 colossal figures were carved from the same stone, seated and immense, their hands resting on their knees, their faces calm and enormous and gazing out over the water toward the north. Each of these seated figures is about 20 meters tall. To stand before them is to feel very deeply how small a human being is. The face of each one is the face of Ramesses himself, that long, serene expression, the double crown, the long, straight nose, the slight curve of a smile that is not quite a smile, but something older and harder to name. And yet, for all their power, for all their enormity, there is something in their stillness that is not aggressive. They simply sit. They have been sitting for more than 3,000 years. They will, one imagines, go on sitting long after everything else has changed. There is a comfort of a strange kind in that permanence. Smaller figures are carved between the great legs of the seated colossi and beside their feet, members of the royal family rendered at human scale, which only deepens the impression of the pharaoh's overwhelming size. Above the entrance, a row of carved baboons raises its arms toward the sky in what appears to be a posture of greeting to the rising sun, a detail that will become important later. And set into a niche above the door, a statue of the sun god Ra-Horakhti stands watching over the whole great facade, as he has watched since the first block of stone was cleared away from the cliff face all those centuries ago. Step now in your imagination through that great doorway and into the cool dark of the interior. The first hall you enter is held up by 8 pillars, each one carved in the form of Osiris, the god of the dead in the afterlife, bearing the features of the king. Along the walls, painted reliefs tell the stories of Ramesses' campaigns, most famously the Great Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittites in what is now Syria, a battle that ended more or less in a draw, but which Ramesses promoted for the rest of his long life as a decisive triumph. The colors have faded with the centuries, but they have not vanished entirely, and in certain light you can still make out the warm ochres and deep blues and soft greens of the original painting, still speaking across 3 millennia of the ambitions and the self-belief of a remarkable man. Beyond the first hall lies a second, smaller hall, and then at the heart of the cliff, the innermost sanctuary. Here in the deepest part of the rock, 4 statues sit together on a low platform at the far end of the room. 3 of them are gods, Ta, Amun-Ra, and Ra-Horakhti, and the 4th is Ramesses himself, placed among the gods as an equal, a bold statement of divine kingship carved in stone and sealed away in the quiet dark. And here is where the great wonder happens. Twice each year, around the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October, dates that are believed to correspond to the king's birthday and his coronation, the rising sun aligns perfectly with the long axis of the temple. In those early morning hours, a shaft of light enters through the great doorway, travels the entire length of the outer hall and the inner hall, passes through the sanctuary entrance, and falls directly upon 3 of the 4 seated figures at the far end of the room. It lights the faces of Amun-Ra, Ra-Horakhti, and Ramesses himself, holding them in a brief golden warmth before the sun moves on and the darkness returns. Only Ta, the god associated with the underworld, remains in shadow. The engineers who designed this alignment, and there were surely engineers, people who understood the mathematics of the sun's movement and the geometry of the rock, achieved something that has never quite stopped astonishing the people who come to witness it. That a shaft of sunlight entering a doorway carved into a cliff in a remote desert at the edge of a continent should travel more than 60 meters through the dark and touch exactly the right faces on exactly the right mornings. It is not magic, but it feels like a very deep kind of intention. Someone long ago cared enough about this to make it happen, and then the rock held it, faithful and exact, through all the long centuries of forgetting. A little to the north of the Great Temple, carved into the same cliff, stands the second of the two temples at Abu Simbel, and this one tells a different story. The smaller temple was built by Rameses in honor of his queen, Nefertari. Among the royal wives of ancient Egypt, Nefertari holds a particular place, not merely as the favorite wife of a powerful pharaoh, but as a figure honored in her own right with a tenderness that is unusual and moving. Rameses dedicated this temple to her and to the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty and music, and he had it inscribed with words that have survived the centuries, "She for whom the sun shines." The facade of Nefertari's temple is smaller than that of the Great Temple, but no less beautiful. 6 colossal figures stand in niches carved into the cliff face, 3 on each side of the entrance. 4 of them are Rameses and 2 are Nefertari, and here's the remarkable thing. In the conventions of Egyptian royal art, a queen or a consort was typically shown at a much smaller scale than the king, reaching perhaps to his knee. But at Abu Simbel, Nefertari stands as tall as Rameses himself. The figures are of equal size, gazing out together from the golden cliff, side by side, as if to say that here, in this far and sacred place, she stood beside him not as a lesser figure, but as his equal. It is a tenderness expressed in stone, and it has endured. Inside the smaller temple, the chambers are dedicated to the rituals of Hathor, and the painted walls show the queen in the presence of the goddess, her figure slender and graceful, her headdress elaborate and beautiful. The temple is quieter than the Great One, and perhaps more intimate, and it holds a different quality of feeling, something softer, something that reaches a little more easily toward the human heart. For many hundreds of years, the people of Egypt and Nubia would have come to these temples to worship, to make offerings, to participate in the ceremonies that the priests maintained. But empires change, and religions change, and the world that built Abu Simbel slowly became a different world. The temples fell out of use. The priests stopped coming. The desert wind, patient and indifferent, began its long work. Over the centuries that followed, the sands crept in. The Nile floods rose and fell, and the wind carried dust from the desert, grain by grain, decade by decade, until the great seated figures at the entrance were buried to their chins, and then over their heads, and finally the whole facade was hidden beneath a smooth and featureless slope of drifted sand. The temples became a rumor, then a legend, then a silence. Travelers in the ancient and medieval worlds passed by along the river, and some of them must have noticed the odd smooth curve of that buried cliff, but no one for a very long time went to look more closely. The place returned to the desert kept it. And then in the early 1800s, a Swiss traveler named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was moving through Nubia, making notes on the antiquities he observed along the river. He had already, some years before, become the first European to describe the carved rock city of Petra in what is now Jordan. And in 1813, following the Nile south, he came to a place where the cliff above the water showed the tops of something unusual, enormous stone faces, barely visible above the sand, gazing out over the river with that long, calm, and human expression. Burckhardt could not excavate, but he recorded what he saw and reported back to the wider world that something extraordinary lay buried in the cliff. It was several years later, in 1817, that the Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni managed to clear enough sand from the entrance of the great temple to push inside and see what lay within. What he found astonished him: the painted halls, the colossal pillars, the sanctuary with its seated gods. Word spread, and in the years that followed, travelers and scholars and artists came from across Europe to see the newly revealed wonders, making long and difficult journeys upriver to reach this remote place. Egypt in the 19th century was undergoing a period of intense foreign interest, much of it exploitative, but some of it genuinely scholarly, and Abu Simbel became one of the great wonders on the route of anyone traveling the Upper Nile. Artists painted the great facade. Photographers, once photography existed, made long exposures in the desert light. Egyptologists copied the inscriptions and the reliefs. working in the dim interior by candlelight, filling notebooks that would eventually make their way back to the museums and libraries of Europe. The sand kept shifting, of course. What Belzoni had cleared would drift back, and the temples would be partly buried again and then cleared again, and so the rhythm continued through the decades. But the world now knew that Abu Simbel was there, and it was not going to be forgotten a second time. Or so it seemed. In the 1950s and 60s, the government of Egypt undertook one of the great engineering projects of the modern era, the construction of the Aswan High Dam, far to the north of Abu Simbel along the Nile. The dam would bring electricity to millions of people, regulate the annual flood that had both sustained and threatened Egyptian agriculture for thousands of years, and create a vast reservoir stretching hundreds of kilometers upstream. It was a project born of genuine need, and it transformed the country. But the reservoir that the dam would create, a lake now called Lake Nasser, would also flood the Nile Valley far to the south. And the rising waters, everyone understood, would eventually reach Abu Simbel. The great temples, which had survived the centuries beneath the sand, which had been rediscovered and revealed and marveled at and studied, would disappear again beneath the water, and this time permanently. The thought of it was, to many people around the world, unbearable. In the early 1960s, an international appeal went out. The temples of Abu Simbel were irreplaceable, said the appeal. They belonged not to Egypt alone, but to all of humanity, and the nations of the world were called upon to come together and find a way to save them. What followed was one of the largest and most complex heritage rescue operations ever attempted in human history. Various proposals were considered before the work began. Some engineers suggested building a vast transparent dam around the temples to keep the water out, or floating the entire cliff on a kind of artificial island. These ideas were studied carefully and ultimately set aside. The solution that was finally chosen was the most audacious of all. The temples would be cut apart and moved. The work began in the mid-1960s. First, the great hillside above and around the temples was carefully removed to expose the rock from above and from the sides. Then, using precision saws and hand tools where the saws could not go, teams of workers from many nations cut the temples into blocks. Not random blocks, but carefully numbered pieces, each one marked to show exactly where it had come from and where it would need to go, the way one might take apart a vast and ancient puzzle and keep careful track of every piece. The blocks were lifted by cranes and transported up the cliff to a site about 60 meters higher and about 200 meters back from the river, far enough back and high enough up to be safe from the rising lake. And there on the new site, the engineers did something that had never been done before at this scale. They reassembled the temples, block by numbered block, fitting each piece back into exactly the right position relative to all the others. To hold the temples together and give them the appearance of the original cliff, 2 large domes of concrete were constructed over them, covered with sand and rock to look, from the outside, like the natural hillside that the temples had once been part of. The entire hillside, in a sense, was recreated. And the sun alignment, that delicate, exquisite arrangement that someone had engineered 3,000 years before to send a shaft of morning light all the way to the figures in the inner sanctuary. The engineers of the 1960s calculated and recalculated and repositioned the temples so that the alignment was preserved. Not perfectly, the dates of the twice-yearly illumination now fall one day later than in the original position, but the miracle itself was saved. The sun still comes. The light still falls on those 3 faces in the dark. About 50 countries contributed to the cost and the labor of the rescue. Engineers, archaeologists, geologists, and craftspeople from Egypt and from nations across Europe and beyond worked side by side on the cliffs above the rising lake. The project took 4 years to complete. The lake rose behind them as they worked, and when the work was done and the waters reached their full height, the temples of Abu Simbel sat dry and intact on their new hilltop above the blue surface of the lake, precisely as they had been, looking out over a transformed landscape with the same calm, unhurried expression they had worn for 30 centuries. It is one of the things human beings have done that makes one feel, quietly and without fanfare, hopeful. There is something in the story of Abu Simbel that goes beyond the facts of its construction and its rescue. something that sits at the meeting place of time and intention, and the human refusal to let beautiful things simply disappear. The pharaoh who built these temples was a man of enormous self-regard. That much is plain from the sheer number of colossal images of himself he placed across the land. But he was also, in his way, a man who understood that time was long and that stone was the best medium for speaking across it. He had his name cut deep into every surface. He had his face carved 20 meters tall above the river. He arranged the architecture of his temples so that light itself would honor him twice each year. He wanted to last. And he has, not in the way he imagined. There are no priests now making offerings before his statue, no scribes recording his glory in the temple archives, but in a different and perhaps stranger way. People travel to this remote place from every part of the world, and they stand before his colossal face in the desert light, and they feel something, awe or wonder or a kind of vertigo at the depth of time, and in that feeling, Rameses is somehow present, not alive, but present. Not remembered the way a friend is remembered, but known in the way one knows certain mountains or certain pieces of old music, as a thing that has existed and still exists and carries its own particular weight in the world. And Nefertari is there beside him, as large as the king, as she has always been in this one extraordinary place, gazing out over the water with that quiet dignity, she for whom the sun shines. Egypt has held so many stories in this long evening together. Stories of builders and believers and dreamers, of priests and painters and workers who dragged stone across the desert sand. People who watched the Nile rise and fall and rise again, who looked up at the same stars we look up at and found in them the shapes of their gods and the measure of their years. People who made colossal things and intimate things, hard things and tender things. People who painted the walls of their tombs with the faces of their children, and who wrote prayers for the dead on scraps of papyrus, and who carved the names of queens into the living rock of cliffs above a river that still runs on. All of those stories have lived here together in this long episode, in this ancient land of gold and stone and deep blue sky. We have walked through the shadow of pyramids and stood in the cool of the temples and rested a moment in the hush of the desert. And now we come to the end of them, or rather to a place of rest, a place where the telling grows quiet and the river runs on without us, and the desert settles back into its ancient, unhurried patience. Somewhere far to the south, the great stone faces still gaze northward over the water. The lake lies still and wide around the base of the hill. The sun, in its own good time, will enter the long corridor of the temple, and the light will travel all the way through the dark and fall on the old carved faces in the inner room, and the darkness will return. This has been happening for more than 3,000 years, and it will go on happening long after all the rest of us are gone. And there is something in that continuity, not quite comfort, but something quieter and more lasting than comfort, something that feels, in the small hours, almost like peace. Let that peace find you now, here, tonight. The story of ancient Egypt is long and rich and full of things we have not had time to touch, and yet even a small portion of it is enough to feel the depth and strangeness and beauty of what human beings have made when they were not afraid to make things that would outlast them. Temples hollowed from cliffs, shafts of light aimed at stone faces across 3,000 years, a queen carved as tall as a king, standing in the warmth of the desert sun. These things were made for the gods, perhaps, or for the pharaohs, or for the life that was believed to come after this one. But they have come to belong to all of us, across the long centuries, carried gently forward through the dark by the hands of many nations and the slow faithfulness of the stone. Rest now, let the great cliffs grow dim and very far away. Let the river murmur on without you, somewhere south of everything familiar. Let the enormous calm faces settle back into the golden cliff, patient and immense, watching over water that goes on and on and on, southward, toward the heart of Africa, toward the dark and the stars. You have traveled a long way tonight. Let yourself drift softly into sleep.